Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao-Ming Revolution, and I got a World War III alert. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Now, all of y'all know I warned Trump not to try to bluff Putin. Y'all know we warned Trump, don't act tough now. He didn't listen. Now he's found out who he really is, and there's nothing he can do about it. Salute. Zelensky, you hide not, but Putin is looking for you. There's nowhere to hide. The humiliation is serious today. Terror rains down on Ukraine.
A night of fire and explosions on the night of May 24, 2025, the Ukrainian capital experienced one of the most massive combined strikes. Kyiv was besieged by the attack for several hours. About 5 hours of continuous bombardment.
Maybe 4 or 5 days ago, maybe a week ago, Ukraine made a mistake. They tried to attack Moscow with 1,000 drones. 1,000. Oh, the West bragged about it. Oh, they said Ukraine was trying to target some type of military places. No, they weren't. They're trying to terrorize women and kids. They failed. Russia got the best air defense in the world. That's a fact. But the humiliation that's going on right now, because it proves Trump just said he sent Zelensky Patriot systems. We're gonna look into that. Germany, y'all say y'all sent them the best air defense y'all had. Britain too. Whoa. You telling me y'all sent them the best air defense system y'all had, and there's nothing that Ukraine can do but get bombed? What this means is, if Putin was fighting the United States or any of those NATO puppets, their cities will be receiving the same devastation.
Took place, during which hundreds of powerful explosions by Russian missiles and drones, including air defense missiles, thundered over the capital.
There's nothing they can do about it.
The night sky was lit up with flashes of light in the city. Witnesses described the scene as hellfire.
Hellfire. They said it just was terror. Everybody was hiding. They thought hell had came. They all thought they was dead. Everybody thought they was dead. That's what they're saying. But they thought that Trump was going to protect them. They just signed a big deal with a minerals deal. What happened, Trump? Trump scammed these people. He can't protect these people.
Earlier, the Russian Foreign Ministry promised a decisive response to what it called an irresponsible attack by Zelensky regime on Russia.
That's right.
Reportedly, a wide-ranging attack by the Russian armed forces using ballistic missiles, such as Caliber and Iskander, and uranium drones, one of which was a precision strike.
The Iskander cruise missile. Oh, my goodness. Oh, that's giving NATO nightmares because they can't shoot it down. And it can carry nuclear warheads. Oh, yes, it can. Oh, yes. And Russia used the Iskander to hunt the U.S. Patriot missile system. They're not going to say that because then they wouldn't be able to make no more money around the world if Russia is hunting. You don't supposed to hunt the U.S. air defense system. You're supposed to be scared of it. Oh, not today. Russia hunted it and destroyed it.
On the Ukrainian military plant, Antonov plant, a key facility for the production of Ukrainian drones.
I bet y'all don't.
Photos and videos showed a large fire breaking out at the important.
You're not going to see this on the news. They're going to show you kids crying till your playground got hit, a school got hit, a nursing home got hit. Not true.
Site, with thick smoke visible from several kilometers away, dealing a serious blow to Ukrainian ability to produce and deploy UAV. According to Ukrainian sources, the armed forces of Ukraine estimated the night attack on Ukraine at 69 cruise missiles and 298 uraniums, with 2 salvos of Caliber missiles launched from the Black Sea, where 7 missile carriers were seen. Despite the claims, the air defenses around the capital appeared to be overwhelmed, lacking ammunition and firepower, struggling to cope with the sheer number of incoming strikes. Around 20 consecutive strikes by ballistic missiles and uraniums, were counted in the area of the plant, causing a large fire. Footage shows where the Russian flights landed and how many Kiev air defense missiles were fired. At one point, 2 Patriot systems were activated simultaneously, firing the entire package to intercept the incoming objects, but the Russian missiles were seen landing and hitting their targets. Some geraniums also appeared to have hit the Patriot launchers themselves, although due to the camera angle, this could not be confirmed with absolute certainty. Military sources cited a shortage of operational missiles and systems, noting that the defense network was overloaded and unable to intercept the entire wave. Even Western-supplied systems such as Patriots were unable to stop such a concentrated attack. The Patriots served in anti-air combat with strike squadrons, but it clearly did not contribute much to the interception of a single small geranium, repeatedly targeting the same location at Antonov plant. Meanwhile, citing interesting information from several sources, Yuri Inat, a spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, stated that Russia has modernized its Iskander-M ballistic missile, making them more difficult to intercept by Patriot system. The upgraded missiles reportedly drop radar decoys and follow quasi-ballistic trajectories, maneuvering on final approach to evade defenses.
Is the devastating effectiveness of the Russian Iskander-M missile against Ukraine's Patriot air defense system a harbinger of a new era in warfare where advanced technology fails to protect innocent lives, or does it expose a deeper crisis in the reliability of Western military support?
Ukraine has no Patriot systems. Those are U.S. Patriot systems, and they got to be manned by U.S. military personnel. But the bigger picture is this is some of the best air defense the U.S. got. If Russia can hunt them and destroy them at will, it's a game over. But you should have never sent to Ukraine so Russia could practice doing this to you. So now if you fight Russia, you're damn sure defenseless now.
Support. In the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the emergence of advanced weaponry has dramatically altered the battlefield dynamics. One of the most shocking developments has been the deployment of the Russian Iskander-M missile system, which has proven to be a formidable adversary against Ukraine's air defense systems, particularly the American-made Patriot missile system. Reports have surfaced detailing how the Iskander-M successfully penetrated and destroyed these sophisticated defenses, leaving military analysts and strategists in awe of its capabilities. The destruction of the Patriot system not only signifies a tactical victory for Russia, but also raises alarming questions about the effectiveness of Western military technology in modern warfare. The Iskander-M missile, with its terrifying speed and precision, has become a game-changer on the battlefield. Capable of traveling at speeds exceeding Mach 2, the Iskander-M can evade radar detection and interceptors, making it a nightmare for any air defense system. The recent incidents involving the destruction of Patriot missile batteries in Ukraine have sent shockwaves through military circles, highlighting the vulnerabilities of even the most...
You're not going to hear about this on the news. You're not going to hear about this anywhere, because if they tell people about this, U.S. military stocks plunged, the U.S. Defense contracts crash. Nobody want to buy nothing from them, which they shouldn't want to buy anything from them anymore, since they just seen what Pakistan did to some of the equipment India had from France, like the fighter jet.
Advanced defense systems. As the dust settles on these engagements, the implications for future conflicts and the balance of power in the region become increasingly concerning. The capabilities of the Iskander-M missile. The Iskander-M is a tactical ballistic missile system developed by Russia, designed to engage a variety of targets with high precision. It boasts a range of approximately 500 kilometers, allowing it to strike deep into enemy territory. The missile is equipped with advanced...
Anywhere in Europe. It can hit anywhere in Europe. Putin already told him he can hit anywhere in Europe, hit any of the defense contractors, any of their military, and there's nothing they can do about it. Military fields, nothing. But he's proven it in Ukraine, so they want to play these stupid games. This is what fuck around and find out is all about. You can't protect Zelensky. He's gonna have to surrender. It's nothing you can do. And Trump has been humiliated. What you gonna do now, Trump? I told Trump, don't try to bluff for Putin. Now he's humiliated. What you gonna do? Sanction him? That ain't tough enough, tough guy.
Guidance systems, including inertial navigation and satellite guidance, which enhance its accuracy to within a few meters of the target. This level of precision is critical when engaging high-value targets such as missile defense systems. One of the most alarming features of the Iskander-M is its ability to carry multiple warheads, including conventional and nuclear payloads. This versatility allows the missile to adapt to different combat scenarios, making it a potent threat. The missile's warhead can be programmed to detonate at a specific altitude, maximizing its destructive potential against surface targets. This capability is particularly effective against air defense systems like the Patriot, which rely on their radar and missile interceptors to protect against incoming threats. How the Iskander-M engages targets. When the Iskander-M is deployed against a target such as the Patriot missile system, it follows a sophisticated attack profile designed to maximize its chances of success. The missile's launch is typically preceded by extensive reconnaissance and intelligence gathering operations to identify the location and operational status of the target. Once the target is confirmed, the Iskander-M is launched from a mobile platform, allowing for rapid repositioning and minimizing the risk of counter-battery fire. Upon launch, the Iskander-M ascends rapidly, reaching its cruising altitude before engaging its terminal phase. During this phase, the missile employs a combination of speed, maneuverability, and low-altitude flight to evade detection and interception. The missile can perform evasive maneuvers, making it difficult for radar systems to lock onto it. This is particularly crucial when targeting advanced air defense systems like the Patriot, which rely on tracking incoming threats to launch interceptors. As the Iskander-M approaches its target, it descends at a steep angle, further complicating interception efforts. The missile's terminal guidance system takes over, ensuring that it remains on course to strike.
And I just saw that Putin is having a meeting with the leader of the Houthi rebels in Moscow sometime this week. That's bad news for Israel and NATO in the West. You see these type of missiles like this, you know, they might find their way into the hands of the Houthis. If not this, something similar to this.
Strike the target with pinpoint accuracy. The combination of high speed, low altitude, and advanced guidance technology makes the Iskander-M a formidable opponent for any air defense system. The impact of Iskander-M on the Patriot system. The destruction of the Patriot missile system by the Iskander-M has significant implications for military strategy and defense planning. The Patriot system, known for its advanced radar and interceptor capabilities, was considered one of the most reliable air defense systems available. However, the Iskander-M's ability to bypass these defenses raises questions about the effectiveness of existing air defense technologies in the face of evolving threats. The loss of Patriot batteries not only diminishes Ukraine's air defense capabilities, but also sends a message to other nations relying on similar systems. The psychological impact of such defeats can lead to a reevaluation of military strategies and alliances as countries seek to bolster their defenses against emerging threats. The Iskander-M success...
The Patriot system is the system all of NATO buys from the U.S. and planned on defending themselves from the Russians. That's what the U.S. sent to Israel, Patriot systems, and the THAAD system, which is a little bit more advanced than the Patriots for ballistic missiles and things of that nature. But it can be destroyed too by the Russians. But so this is so humiliating for the U.S. That's why they're not going to be talking about this. That's why they're crying and saying Putin targeted nurseries and stuff like that. Lies, lies, lies. Trump, he's very upset. What happened when you get upset? What are you going to do about it, Trump? Don't bluff Putin, boy. This is what happened.
Against the Patriot system serves...
Remember Trump was saying, Putin need to come to the table. All right, who the hell you think you're talking to? This is what Putin is saying. Who the hell do you think you're talking to, bro?
Is a stark reminder of the need for continuous innovation and adaptation in military technology. Technological advancements and countermeasures. In response to the threat posed by systems like the Iskander-M, military strategists are exploring various countermeasures to enhance the effectiveness of air defense systems. This includes the development of advanced radar technologies capable of detecting low-flying and high-speed targets, as well as the integration of artificial intelligence to improve threat assessment and response times. Additionally, there is a growing emphasis on the need for layered defense systems
Putin already told them they're never gonna catch up, because when you trying to better your system, he already told you they're gonna better the missiles like they did in Ukraine, like they already did. So the West is trying to catch up, and Russia's gonna keep on advancing further and further. I told you, because the West stole all our money. The United States still say they spend more money on military equipment than Russia and China and Britain and them put together. They do, but the defense contractors get the money. They're billionaires, and this crap is on the battlefield, and they're steadily losing these wars.
Combine various types of interceptors to create a more robust defense against multiple incoming threats. Moreover, the lessons learned from the engagements between the Iskander-M and the Patriot system are likely to influence future military procurement and development strategies. Nations may prioritize investments in next-generation air defense systems that can better withstand the challenges posed by advanced missile technologies. This could lead to a new arms race in missile defense as countries seek to outpace one another in developing more effective countermeasures. The Iskander-M missile system has demonstrated its terrifying capabilities in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, successfully destroying advanced air defense systems like the Patriot. Its combination of speed, precision, and advanced guidance technology makes it a formidable weapon on the modern...
Trump just sent those Patriot systems over there, man. Now Ukraine gonna have to buy... Trump, are you in on this? Trump, are you in on this, man? You just finessed them people out there money for them Patriot systems. Now they destroyed? What a joke.
Battlefield. As military analysts continue to assess the implications of these developments, it is clear that the Iskander-M has reshaped the landscape of warfare, challenging the effectiveness of established defense systems and prompting a reevaluation of military strategies worldwide. The lessons learned from these engagements will undoubtedly influence future conflicts and the evolution of military technology for years to come. In summary, the Iskander-M's ability to effectively neutralize the Patriot missile system underscores the need for continuous innovation in military technology and strategy. As nations grapple with the realities of modern warfare, the balance of power may shift dramatically, with advanced missile systems like the Iskander-M playing a pivotal role in shaping the future of military engagements. The ongoing conflict serves as a stark reminder of the ever-evolving nature of warfare and the critical importance of adapting to new threats in order to maintain strategic advantages on the battlefield.
As history shows, the main problem of Western countries is that they constantly underestimate Russia and its capabilities. This is primarily due to the fact that the West, on a subconscious level, continuously experiences a feeling of superiority over this northern giant. As a result, all this leads to bloody armed conflicts, followed by the humiliating defeat of Western warmongers. If we look at history, we will see that Russia has always wanted to be friends with the West. At the same time, Russia made it clear that this friendship should be founded on trust, respect, and equality, embodying a sense of camaraderie and brotherhood. However, unfortunately, overweening pride and a sense of its
Revolutionary salute to our brother Randy Thomas for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, family. Salute. Hotel.
own exclusiveness did not allow the West to treat Russia as an equal. And now, in the 21st century, we see how history repeats itself. If you listen closely to Putin's legendary speech during the Munich conference, you will realize that, even at that time, the young Russian president cautioned Western leaders about dire consequences if they continued with their globalist unipolar system. Moreover, during this speech, Vladimir Putin also criticized NATO's planned expansion to the east and the deployment of American missiles near Russia's borders. Back then, Vladimir Putin officially declared that everything that was happening was a serious provocation by the West, and that this provocation posed a threat to Russia's national security. In this regard, Vladimir Putin made it clear that Russia would be forced to react harshly to the West's unfriendly steps, as a result of which the whole world could face the risk of starting a new global war. In 2007, the Russian president urged the West to finally stop and abandon its imperialist ambitions for the benefit of all mankind. However, as time has shown, the West not only rejected Putin's request, but also escalated the situation. A year after Putin's speech at the Munich conference, the West officially invited Georgia and Ukraine to join the North Atlantic Alliance. Moreover, by a strange coincidence, government coups took place in these countries, as a result of which pro-Western puppets came to power, ready to carry out any orders from European and American globalists. As a result, in 2007, Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, on the orders of his masters from the United States and Europe, demanded that Russia withdraw all its military bases from Georgia. Moreover, a year later, on the orders of Mikhail Saakashvili and his NATO military advisors, the Georgian army shelled the territory of South Ossetia, resulting in the death of dozens of Russian peacekeepers. Against this backdrop, Russia was compelled to engage in an actual war with Georgia, which ultimately resulted in Moscow compelling the Georgian authorities to make peace. As a result, Georgia lost its controlled territories in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. By the way, the War of 2008 is still regarded as the first clash between NATO and Russia. It is noteworthy that it was after this war that Vladimir Putin began to intensively modernize the Russian army and prepare all Russian army units for the conflict against the North Atlantic Alliance. And, as the current conflict in Ukraine shows, Vladimir Putin has coped with this task quite successfully. Surprisingly, even Russia's enemies have begun to admit that the West's tactics of weakening Russia have completely failed. According to them, Vladimir Putin managed not only to destroy all the West's plans, but also to turn the Russian army into the world's most powerful military force. By the way, this fact was also recognized by American experts from the reputable magazine U.S. News and World Report. In particular, they called the Russian army the most powerful in the world. Moreover, over the past 10 months, representatives of the Western media have also begun to recognize this fact. I remember that quite recently in the West, only military experts were declaring the power of the Russian army, and these statements were not widespread in the Western media. However, now the situation seems to have changed. In the United States, it seems they decided not to hide the obvious fact. So, an American authoritative newspaper, the New York Times, stated that the Russian army has become modern and deadly. According to the New York Times, over the past decade, the Russian Air Force has acquired more than 1,000 new aircraft. Among them are the country's most advanced Su-35 fighter jets, a squadron of which was transferred to Belarus to participate in joint military exercises in summer 2025. The New York Times practically praises the Russian army, which provoked the ire of some American politicians who accused the American newspaper of pro-Russian propaganda. Meanwhile, the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, said that the new capabilities of the Russian army were obvious during the start of the Russian military operation in Syria in 2015. The military capabilities of the Russian army were not only effective, but also shocked many in the Pentagon. I am ashamed to admit it, but a few years ago, I was surprised when Caliber cruise missiles were launched from the Caspian Sea and hit targets in Syria. This was a surprise for me, and we didn't even know that Russian warships with Caliber cruise missiles on board were in the Caspian Sea, said Ben Hodges. Kremlin thinking has also evolved about the size of the military. Now Russia's armed forces rely less on a dwindling number of recruits, but on a small well-trained corps of 400,000 professional contract soldiers. In addition to modernizing Russian weapons, the Russian military command is also developing a theory of how all this should be used. According to an international security specialist from the Reichman University in Israel, Dmitry Adamski, the Russian military has created a new art of strategy, the so-called cross-domain coercion. It is a combination of the real or potential use of force with diplomacy, cyber attacks, and propaganda to achieve the political goals of Russia. Dmitry Adamski claims that this new Russian strategy is manifested in the current crisis around Ukraine. Russia insists on immediate large-scale concessions from the West. The transfer of Russian troops to allied Belarus led to the fact that the Russian army was within a radius of 100 miles from Kiev. Meanwhile, Russian state media warns that Ukrainian forces are preparing an act of aggression against Belarus, thereby creating additional information pressure, Dmitry Adamski said. Russia's military modernization is also increasingly designed to send a message to the United States by projecting military power beyond Eastern Europe, which ends up surprising and sometimes shocking U.S. officials. For example, it took Russian military transport aircraft just a few hours to begin airlifting more than 2,000 Russian peacekeepers, along with heavily armored vehicles to the South Caucasus after President Putin brokered an end to the war of 2020 between Azerbaijan and Armenia. In Syria, where Russia intervened in 2015, with limited ground troops and air power, Moscow's progress has shown the world that Russia can effectively use precision-guided weapons. According to experts, Russia has used the war in Syria as a laboratory to test new tactics and weapons, and to gain combat experience for most of its armed forces. The 17th Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO Allied Command Operations, a four-star general, Philip Mark Breedlove, stated that the condition of the Russian army is at a very high level, and its most important advantage is that it is a learning and adaptive force. Every time we see the Russian army in conflict, it gets better and better. The American general also recalled the war in Georgia, and added that the Russian army knows how to benefit from its mistakes. Russian troops quickly defeated the Georgian army, but the war revealed deep flaws in the Russian army. The ground troops didn't maintain radio contact with the Air Force, which led to several Russian airstrikes on their units. Communication was so poor that some officers had to use their own cell phones. Tanks and armored personnel carriers often broke down. All this led to the fact that the Russian army began to radically modernize. According to experts, it took Russia a little over 10 years to create the world's best electronic warfare systems, which are now in service with the country. The former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, also said that the United States is now trying to catch up with Russia in the field of modern weapons. For the past 20 years, we have been focused on iPhones, mobile phones, and terrorist networks around the world, while the Russians continued to develop hypersonic technologies and powerful systems for interception and suppression, Ben Hodges said. My dear truth seekers, it seems the Americans were sure that Russia would never rise from its knees after the collapse of the Soviet Union. U.S. overconfidence and a bad habit of underestimating Russia have led Washington to the humiliating role of catching up. Moreover, in early May of this year, pro-government American think tanks made a rather alarming forecast for the West. In particular, they stated that after the end of the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian army will maintain the status of the world's most powerful military force for decades. According to them, over the 3 years of fighting in Ukraine, the Russian army has proved to the whole world that it has the ability not only to fight, but also to win. In addition, experts also appreciated Vladimir Putin's competent decisions regarding the Russian military-industrial complex, which allowed the Russian army to adopt hypersonic missiles, and even fifth-generation submarines that have no analogues in the world. Thus, as you can see, thanks to Vladimir Putin's consistent and competent strategy, Moscow has managed not only to destroy all Western plans to weaken Russia, but also to turn the Russian army into the most powerful military force in the world. Indeed, everything that is happening indicates that the Russian army will retain this status for many decades to come.
All the rest of them said absolutely not. NATO will never negotiate with Russia. Russia doesn't get to dictate what NATO does. Because, NATO exists in a vacuum. But if anybody else on the planet was to adopt the same position, saying, well, NATO is never going to dictate to us, we will actually go in Mexico and create military bases. What would the United States say to that? Well, I imagine nothing good. Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Today is Sunday, the 25th of May, and this is my only video update of the day. Today, we're going to discuss the frontline situation in Ukraine just a little bit more than usual. And that's because certain developments have been reported. And spoiler alert, is not looking good for the green t-shirt whatsoever. And after we get through these frontline updates, that's when we're going to go to the place where we normally go to the political circus and propaganda on the European scene, brought to us by none other than Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy. We have Mr. Landsbergis from Lithuania, so I think that should give you a pretty good taste of what's to come. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and actually start with what happened last night. One of the biggest Russian aerial attacks has taken place over Ukraine, and it involved more than 350 missiles and drones. And as usual, the Ukrainian media has reported that over 90% of these have actually been downed. This begs a question, a legitimate one. If only 6 to 7% actually managed to get through, then how come that the damage they cause is so catastrophic to the point where the green t-shirt and Mr. Sibia immediately came out and asked for more sanctions on Russia? I mean, that's the default response, no thought given, just put the statement out and hope for the best. But at the same time, what's very important to understand is that a similar attack has taken place over Russia, not involving as many drones and missiles, but still the intention was the exact same. But of course, nobody's really reporting on that, only on what Russia does, because that's exactly how propaganda works. Even though, if you was to go on Ukrainska Pravda, or on the New Voice of Ukraine, or on the million other media outlets, you will see the exact same thing. The Ukrainian army is bolstering about attacking this part in Russia and that plant and this. It's a joy, isn't it? Now, with that said, the green t-shirt and Mr. Sibia immediately came out and said, look, these are not the actions of a country that wants peace. Well, when you have a ceasefire, at that point, you can judge what that ceasefire brings you. But up until you get to the point of having a ceasefire, you can't ask for the enemy to behave as if a ceasefire was already in effect, because certainly Ukraine doesn't do that. Nobody ever does. This is not a Russia-Ukraine thing. This is how wars are. Once you enter a ceasefire, that's when you can expect for complete silence to ensue. But up until that point, well, you have to go through the motions, I'm afraid. Now, with that said, let us go to the front line, because there's some developments which have been reported, and it's not a good one. Russians managed to gain foothold in Sumy Oblast, Deep State analysts say. Deep State, a Ukrainian group of military analysts, has reported that Russian forces have managed to gain a foothold in Sumy Oblast along the Veselivka-Zhuravka-Novenke-Basivka section. On its interactive map of hostilities, which I'm going to show you in a minute, Deep State has marked this area as occupied rather than designating it a gray zone. I was actually patiently waiting for them to report on this, because this didn't happen last night, and it did not happen overnight. This has been developing for at least the last 10 days. But it's Deep State, it's Ukraine, so you would have to forgive them for not rushing to report on Russian battlefield successes. But with that said, let me show you the map, and maybe you will understand why the Russians have chosen that exact point. So this is the area we're talking about, and it sits right at the border between Ukraine and Russia. It also must be noted that this was one of the main launch pads for the Green T-shirts Kursk incursion last August. This is why the Russians are now trying to position themselves here and establish what Vladimir Putin has called a buffer zone. Personally, I think that this has everything to do with that buffer zone that the Russians keep talking about. Deep State also reported on Saturday, the 24th of May, that the Russians had advanced near the settlements of Odradne, Troitske, Novenke, Basivka, and Zhuravka. Now, Odradne is in Donetsk Oblast, Troitske is in Zaporizhia, Zhuravka is in Sumy. So what's the message here? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? The Russians are advancing all across the line of contact. And maybe this is why, maybe, just maybe, why the green t-shirt has become such a big pacifist ever since the fighting season began in 2025, which was at around mid-March. But this, of course, is not all. Let me take you over to the next article. Kupiansk in Kharkiv Oblast, 90% destroyed or damaged. Situation is critical. And this comes from Andriy Besedin, head of Kupiansk City Military Administration. Besedin said that the situation in the Kupiansk Hromada is not difficult, but critical. The Russians are attacking the central parts of the settlements with guided aerial bombs, artillery, MLRS, and FPV drones. Now, the green t-shirt is going left, right, and center, giving statements and boasting about the high number of FPV drones that Ukraine can produce. Basically, they're saying Ukraine is #1 in the world when it comes to drones. Personally, I don't buy into that, but even if that was true, drones do help you defend. That's what drones are best for. But drones do not put you in a position to ever take the initiative. For that, you need the most important resource in any conflict, and that is manpower. And that's the one problem which money from the West cannot solve. It is not a secret that the biggest problem Ukraine has for a number of years now is manpower. And it's not just manpower, because it's not enough to just gobble up people from the street and send them to the front line. It doesn't work that way. They need training, they need rest periods, you need rotation. And that's the area in which Ukrainian army is suffering. But however, my friends, the circus will continue, and I think now we've got to the part where I need to take you to the European scene. Putin remains resolute on victory in Ukraine, US assessment reveals. And this comes from the United States Defense Intelligence Agency. Russian forces continue their gradual advance in Ukraine's east, bolstered by additional troops, including over 10,000 North Korean soldiers deployed in Kursk Oblast to support the offensive. Notice the language. They're saying that the 10,000 North Korean soldiers are supporting the offensive. But in reality, do they? Because if they're deployed in Kursk Oblast, the only purpose those soldiers serve are protecting the border, so that what the Green T-shirt did last August would not happen again. It's very simple. But this is how propaganda works. You use words in a very tricky way to try to mislead people, because most people, especially those who are unfamiliar with the overall situation, would just assume that the 10,000 North Korean soldiers stationed in Kursk will actually emerge into Ukraine, which is not going to happen. But nevertheless, they're saying that Vladimir Putin is poised on obtaining a military victory in Ukraine. And I think this is the perfect time to define what victory is. Because if we were to listen to all of these Western warmongers, they say that Vladimir Putin wanted to conquer all of Ukraine, which was never true. In fact, Vladimir Putin didn't want to conquer anything. And the biggest proof for that is the negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul in 2022. Vladimir Putin, Russia, wasn't going to take any sort of territory. That was about NATO enlargement. It was about the rights of the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine and all of those things. But it was never about territory. The reason they're saying that Vladimir Putin is now poised on military victory is because Vladimir Putin's definition of victory is slightly different. He wants the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, and that would be victory for Russia. Whereas the West, they try to change the goalpost and redefine Russian objectives. This is why such a big disconnect in terms of what the Russians see as a victory and what the West is saying that the Russian victory would be. That's how propaganda gets fueled. The assessment notes that Putin remains committed to imposing post-war neutrality on Ukraine, limiting its military capabilities and further fragmenting the state. And all of that could have been prevented prior to 2022. I don't know, by NATO not pushing their enlargement to Ukraine, by not organizing a coup in 2014, and there's many examples. Even on the cusp of war, on the 17th of December 2021, 2 months before the invasion happened, NATO had a chance to stop all of that by just addressing the Russian memorandum, which was sent to the White House on the 11th hour. But of course, Jake Sullivan and all the rest of them said absolutely not. NATO will never negotiate with Russia. Russia doesn't get to dictate what NATO does. Because, you know, NATO exists in a vacuum. But if anybody else on the planet was to adopt the same position, saying, well, NATO is never going to dictate to us, we will actually go in Mexico and create military bases. What would the United States say to that? Well, I imagine nothing good. I think nothing good will come of that. Trump ignores Ukraine aid and focuses on Russia reset, MP Serhiy Rachmanin says. Vladimir Putin is absolutely happy Trump does not interfere substantially in the Ukraine conflict. However, Rachmanin said Trump's first 3 months in office yielded nothing but holding aid and exotic ideas. I'm sure statements like this will prompt Donald Trump to support Ukraine massively. I'm sure Donald Trump responds to this kind of tactics. I have no doubt about it. Quote, the United States was never going to help us, Rachmanin said, adding that only limited aid remains, as in intelligence, early warning missile systems, Starlinks, and critical ammunition. So according to Mr. Rachmanin, that's not help, that's just limited aid. What would Ukraine do without the early warning missile system? I mean, just imagine that. Because they're saying that the downing rate of the Russian missiles is at around 90%. Well, if that's the case, let's just imagine that number is even remotely close. Who do you have to thank that for? Well, it's certainly not the green T-shirt, it's the United States. They're the ones controlling the damage. This is all about damage control. That's why the United States, even though they're not sending military equipment anymore, they still have left intact all of those early warning systems, the Starlink, the critical ammunition, because the last thing that the United States wants is for the Ukrainian army to completely collapse. That being said, what the United States has done for this conflict, even though they've instigated the conflict themselves, has been tremendous. This has costed the US taxpayers an insane amount of money. And this is not about politics here. This is about the American people who have paid for this, for all of it. But you know, Mr. Rachmanin is saying, well, this is not help, this is just limited aid. Well, say that to the US taxpayers. And also say that to the European taxpayers who are actually putting up with higher energy bills, higher grocery prices, and all of this malarkey for this. It's insane. And here comes the heavyweight. Lithuania's former foreign minister mocks delay in delivery of Taurus missiles to Ukraine and anti-Russian sanctions. And this is, of course, Mr. Landsbergis. Known for his outspoken criticism of Russian aggression against Ukraine, Landsbergis did not hold back his sarcasm. He posted a message on Sunday following a night of extensive Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian cities and villages. Quote, "Hello, sorry to disturb you, but have you heard anything about Taurus and those crippling sanctions? Let me know, thanks," Landsbergis said. This is propaganda in full effect. He's saying it as if Taurus missiles and crippling sanctions would stop Russian missiles. They don't, Mr. Landsbergis. You've been getting to the 17th sanctions package and Russia still launches missiles. Haven't you noticed that maybe this is not one of the most effective tactics? Have you tried diplomacy? I mean, even if they wanted to try diplomacy, I'm afraid even that's impossible, because in order to conduct diplomacy, you need diplomats. And I think they're in very short supply in Europe these days. My friends, I'll end this episode here. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the rest of this Sunday.
Hi everyone and welcome. Today on the program we are joined by Scott Ritter, a former US Marine major and also a United Nations weapon inspector. So welcome back to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I think everyone's been curious where Trump is going to go with this presidency, because he himself recognized that in the first administration there were too many neocons who sabotaged what he wanted to do. At least that's what he says, and he was going to put America first this time, which is what he said. But I would say that it also seems that he has some genuine desires to end different wars, including the war against Russia. But now, of course, he brings together both the America first, but also the neocons. I'm never sure if this is to play the good cop, bad cop, or if he just doesn't have control over his administration. But do you see the neocons then having pulled in Trump?
Well, I don't see the neocons having pulled in Trump. I see the neocons. Look, when Trump won this election, he made it clear that he was going to try to improve on mistakes he had made in the past. I think he understood the role played by Mike Pompeo and John Bolton in undermining the national security objectives and priorities that he had laid out, and that he lacked the experience and he lacked the assistance of people he could trust. And one of the reasons was that the political reality of Washington, D.C. is such that the bench upon which you select your cabinet members is actually not very big. And in order to get on that bench to begin with, you have to have experiences that are linked to decades of American national security policy where the neoconservatives have dominated. So in order to become relevant, to be relevant, you had to be willing to play that game and march to the beat of their drum. So Trump still needs to rely on that bench. He can't, there's not a sufficient pool of manpower available to him where he could staff the totality of his cabinet and senior positions with people who didn't come from the establishment. And the other thing is that, the likelihood of Congress or the Senate, allowing Trump to just come in with a clean slate. The Senate is in itself an embodiment of the deep state. These senators are elected for 6-year terms. Many of them have served multiple terms in office. They have been in Washington, D.C. They help define the power establishment. And so they need allies within the administration. So there's a political game being played where Trump has to appoint, a certain number of people in order to give his cabinet the balance necessary for the Senate to allow him to move forward. And so that's what I see has happened here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is a classic, neocon, deep state pick. Anybody who believes that he's loyal to Donald Trump doesn't know little Marco. The two men hate each other, but this was it's political necessity on both parties, and I believe that this appointment was brokered by Miriam Adelson, who gave Trump a lot of money and said they wanted Rubio, and I think Rubio was talked to and told that you're going to have to play the game for a little while. But he's not going to play the game in a way that undermines his credibility and his viability going forward. Little Marco still wants to be president of the United States one day. He's young enough, and now he has a platform to promote, his name, and so he will, fight against Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, Trump is still calling the shots, not little Marco, and not anybody else. Keith Kellogg's not calling the shots. Scott Bessent isn't calling the shots. Donald Trump is calling the shots. He's far more assertive this term than he was during his first term.
Yeah, that is true. But I often think about this one interview you've probably seen with Putin, where he sits down, because of his 25 years as a president, he's seen all this president come and go. And he said that a lot of them come with the genuine ambition to change. But then, as he said, the people come in dark suits and tell the new president how it really is, and it changes. And it reminds me a bit about what Milton Friedman called the tyranny of the status quo. That is, if you want to have a real change in government, you have to do it within the first few weeks. Otherwise, you get captured by the permanent bureaucracy, or the deep state, as it's also called. But in terms of the peace negotiations between the United States and Russia, as I guess the two largest participants in this conflict, do you think Trump understands the concerns of the Russians? Because it's very hard to read the Trump.
First of all, let's start off with that reality. It's very hard to read Trump. So anybody who thinks that they have the perfect insight, I mean, it's always dangerous doing these interviews like this, because you ask a very good question, but it requires me to commit to an answer then is subjected to very close scrutiny over the course of time. And normally when I answer a question like this, it's my answer is based upon experience and patterns of behavior, predictable patterns of behavior, so that if I see a pattern, I can project that pattern into the future and say, I have good reason to believe that this is a probable course of action. With Donald Trump, there is no predictable pattern of behavior. So this is always risky. I'm going to answer the question. I just wanted to, say how difficult these kind of questions are about Donald Trump, because we just don't know. I think Trump fully understands the Russian position, because he's had 3 conversations with Vladimir Putin, the most important of which was the last one, in which I think if we ever get the complete transcript, I think Vladimir Putin laid out in no uncertain terms what the Russian position is, because you saw a modification of Trump's behavior in the aftermath of that phone call, where he made certain statements such as Russia will win this war. I mean, that's an assertion of fact that you don't normally hear come from the White House. I think Joe Biden was that, Russia is losing this war and Russia will never be allowed to win this war. And Trump has said Russia will win this war. And I think the implication is no matter what we do, Russia is going to win this war. And I also think that there's a sense of futility on his part, meaning it's futile to continue repeating the past practices of the past, the practices of the past, because they haven't worked. Sanctions, right now you have Congress getting ready to, go forward with sanctions. It won't work. I mean, these sanctions will require the United States to make decisions regarding the imposition of secondary sanctions against people we want to be our allies. India. We would expect India to stop buying Russian oil at a time when India has bought more Russian oil than they ever have before. China. I don't think the Chinese would even entertain a phone call from the United States about behavioral modification when it comes to Russia. And so, Trump is looking at, a Congress that's trapped in, the past decades, and has to reflect upon Europe and, the European decisions with the 17th tranche of sanctions have been passed, so pathetic that, normally Vladimir Putin is very controlled with his words, called them idiots. In a contest of idiots, they would take second place. I mean, good sense of humor, but language you don't normally get from the Russian president, but he's very frustrated with the stupidity of Europe. And Donald Trump, I think, recognizes the impotence of Europe, and also recognizes his strategic vision of disentanglement from Europe. So I think Trump gets it 100%. The problem is his team isn't on the same page. At the same time, when Trump is making assertions of the inevitability of Russian victory, you have Marco Rubio testifying before the United States Congress saying that Russia won't be able to achieve its goals. I mean, this is a disconnect. Does the Secretary of State make declaratory policy, or does the President of the United States? And whose voice should have more weight? This is the disconnect. You have Keith Kellogg, who's literally off in la la land with the things that he's talking about, totally disconnected from the policy direction that Donald Trump appears to have taken. Even J.D. Vance is, offbeat, saying things, at a time, at least Marco Rubio, when cornered by Congress, I think it was Bill Keating, asked him, is President Putin a war criminal? Understood that you can't answer that question no matter how you feel, because of the need to keep the potential of dialogue and discussion open. But J.D. Vance is giving a speech at one of the military academies where he says that Russia is our enemy and that we have to prepare to go to war and fight them. Not really the speech that should be given right about now. If your policy direction is that of peace. There's a lot of confusion in the Trump administration, and a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that Donald Trump himself seems to be, altering direction every other week. Who knows what he's going to say? And one of the big unknowns, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to forecast Trump, is that a lot of what drives him is ego, and how his ego is being massaged at a particular time, a given day, in a given week. Vladimir Putin had a 2-hour phone call that made Donald Trump feel pretty darn good. But, the benefits of that massage quickly, dissipate over time. And now we have different people whispering in Trump's ears. And will he, he doesn't have the foundation of fact-based knowledge about Russia that is needed to sustain a position over time. And so he is now a victim to, that which is whispered in his ear. And I'm afraid that, this time next week, somebody will be able to whisper something in his ear that gets him to say something completely different. And you see the Russians, they appear not to care. I mean, I'm sure you'll ask about this, but between Lavrov and Putin and Medinsky and the whole crew, Russia's all in for the strategic defeat of Ukraine. There's no room for Russia to yield on any of the issues that Europe and the United States would like them to yield on to create this potential of compromise. I don't think there's any compromise in Russia. I think this is going to finish with Ukraine being compelled to accept unconditional terms of surrender.
I picked up on that. Rubio being confronted with this. Do you condemn the the war crimes? It's interesting. It fits very well in with the European war propaganda model we have as well, because they start off with the moral position that don't you find it morally questionable, or wouldn't you condemn this? And of course, if you don't condemn it, you're a horrible person, and you're finished. So you're not relevant anymore. And if you do recognize it, which is required to be relevant, then you locked yourself in, because if you think you're if you're essentially buying into the narrative that we're fighting Hitler, then we can't anymore have any compromise. We can't have any talks. There's no dialogue to be had, no diplomacy, and the only path forward is then war, more weapons. And this is how we ended up essentially banning political dissent across Europe. But because it looks like Trump has at least 2 occasions said that NATO expansion provoked the Russian invasion. Yeah. Which is important because you have to recognize the concern of the other guy if you actually want to find alleviate this security concern and find peace. And he also recognized that the Russians are, as I said, winning the war and they're holding all the cards. So and if he then understands also that Russia has some security demands which are non-negotiable, such as not having the NATO soldiers in Ukraine, such as the proposal by Keith Kellogg, as you described as La La Land, what is the path forward then? If the Ukrainians and the Europeans refuse to even, I mean, it's not even that they don't want to. At least the Ukrainians talking now. The Europeans, they still don't want to even pick up the phone. So when America says it will either need a negotiated settlement now or walk away, is this already a done deal that they will walk away, or do you think they can pressure the Europeans to, start to see the world as it is?
Well, let's understand that walking away will hurt Europe more than it will hurt Russia. That Trump's walking away isn't that he's walking away from Russia into the arms of Europe, where he will, double down on NATO's viability, increase the number of American forces deployed, supply endless, tranches of weaponry to Ukraine to empower them to somehow defeat the Russian threat. Walking away means he just simply walks away and leaves Russia to its own devices. But I think that there's a different strategy. I do think at the end of the day, the United States will walk away, but they may actually walk toward Russia. We have the Russians are the instigators of the 1,000 to 1,000 trade. They're the ones who put that on the table. So in the mind of Donald Trump, it's the Russians that pushed for this, and they get points. I think either Medinsky or Lavrov recently said that as soon as this prisoner trade is done, Russia will provide in writing the blueprint for a negotiated settlement, which is one of their obligations under the Istanbul II discussions. So Russia will be checking off all the boxes it needs to check off to be seen as being compliant, which is what Putin said. And so Trump's ego will say, I talked to Putin, we made these agreements, and the Russians are living up to their end of the agreement. The problem will come with Ukraine. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of this Istanbul II is the conversation, I think it was reported by Medinsky, that he had with Yermak about where Yermak said, you guys got it far easier than we do because you only have one boss. We have 3. A stunning acknowledgement by the head of or one of the senior members of the Ukrainian delegation that Ukraine is not a sovereign state, that Ukraine has no sovereignty.
Sorry, was this comment made public? I didn't catch it.
My wife, who is a fluent Russian speaker and follows the Russian press, hit me with this morning, and she normally wouldn't commit to something unless she triple check. So I will do my fact is.
Well, I wasn't questioning. I was
fascinating. No, I know. When we talk, my mind goes to answering questions, and so I would have preferred to do this, but while we're talking, I am going to ask her for the source of Medinsky.
Well, I've heard similar comments coming from others, such as the former advisor of Zelensky, Arostovich. He made it point before that the countries who didn't let us have peace, in the first Istanbul, still won't let us have peace today. So,
but he wasn't at the negotiation. This is a senior negotiator of the Ukrainian side, acknowledging to the Russians, we have no sovereignty. And that means that there won't be any peace. I think that that's the reason why there won't be a peace plan is because Ukraine doesn't represent itself. And there are other interests. Remember, the European interest in Ukraine isn't a free and sovereign democratic Ukraine. It's to use Ukraine as a proxy to defeat Russia. And that was also the American goal and objective. So nobody cares about Ukraine. Nobody, not even the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians can't speak for a single voice. This is why a peace process is doomed, because to have peace, both sides have to be interested in peace. Ukraine is not interested in peace. Not at all. No one has articulated anything in Ukraine that remotely resembles reality when it comes to bringing it into this conflict. Ukraine lives in a fantasy land, whether it's a drug-induced fantasy land in Bankova Street in the mind of the president, or ideologically driven fantasy in the minds of the nationalists that he surrounded himself with. The bottom line is there's no reality from a policy perspective coming out of Kiev. And as long as that's the case, then Russia has no choice but to continue to press forward. And from what I'm seeing, every day the situation just gets much worse for the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And now Russia has made a decision, Vladimir Putin, that in addition to the threats made about the 4 oblasts, Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov, becoming part of Novorossiya, Putin has said, yeah, we're going to take 3 additional oblasts, maybe not to incorporate them, but they will become a buffer zone. And so Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkov now are on the block for different purposes. Ukraine's shrinking as we speak. And the one thing about the Russians, they don't commit. Vladimir Putin doesn't commit to something, then walk away from it. So, this commitment is not, I don't believe, a negotiating ploy where he puts something on the table only to withdraw it when a counteroffer is out there. This commitment was made because there is no viable negotiating partner in Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't speak with a single voice. And so this is Vladimir Putin doing what is necessary for Russia to achieve the terms that it demands for peace. And one of the terms is that Ukraine will never again be allowed to put at risk the territory or the people of Belgorod and Kursk.
Yeah, you sound a bit almost word by word like the Arestovich there. He makes the same point as well, that the state more or less has captured, and some of the rationality is now absent. Also focusing on the failure to actually make a peace, because they're in a horrible position at the moment. As you said, of course, the front line's been crumbling a bit for a while, but only on the last few days, what's happening? It's this idea that the front lines can be as stable as they were in the past. I think this is gone, and but it still begs the question of what do you see if the Americans walk away and the Europeans still refuse to pick up a phone, and the Ukrainians don't come together with a common position. How does this play out? Because you say they will get an unconditional surrender. What will Russia demand or take in such a surrender in terms of territory? Do you think they will go for annexing some more regions, or simply doing some buffer zones? What do you think? Well, if the Russians could get anything they want, what would they want? What would they demand? Because in Europe, people are convinced that Russia would take all of Ukraine, but again, this is a bit la la land as well. But what would they take?
I firmly believe that if Russia could write the script, that Russia would have had Crimea, a land bridge to the Donbass, and that's it. And they didn't even want the land bridge. They were willing to give that land bridge away. What Russia wants is a stable Ukraine. What Russia wants is a Ukraine that is not hostile to Russia, that doesn't operate in opposition to Russian interests. a new government. That's what Russia wants. The absorption of territories is not something that comes free of cost. The conversion of Kherson and Zaporizhia. I spoke to the governor of Kherson, and it is not just that you have to deal with the consequences of war, but you are converting Ukrainian oblast that has been subjected to deterioration while Russia was emerging from the nightmare of the 1990s and improving its quality of life. Ukraine was deteriorating, especially in the peripheral oblasts where you had a Russian language dominated population. They were not a priority in terms of investments, infrastructure investments, et cetera. So, the Russians saw this when they took over Crimea in 2014, the horrific damage that had been done to the infrastructure of Crimea, that Russia's now been compelled to spend billions of dollars to fix, and they're still working on it. That exists in Kherson, that exists in Zaporizhia, that of course exists in Donetsk and Lugansk. All of these 4 oblasts have to be brought up to Russian national standards, and this is very expensive. So the idea now of absorbing, Odessa, absorbing Dnipropetrovsk, absorbing Kharkov and Nikolaev, yes, you get to draw a nice little line on the map, but you're now you own that, which means you got to bring it up. That's a big expense, an unbudgeted expense. It's there's no budget in place for the billions of dollars needed to bring these territories up to Russian standards. So I don't think Russia wants that. I don't think Vladimir Putin wants that. He looks at the Russian reality and says, we're doing okay. We have an economy that's functioning, that's growing. But the last thing we need to do is sink it by bringing in these unfunded mandates that are brought about. So they will only take these 4 oblasts have driven to that decision point by, the realities of national security. And I think that's what's going to happen. I do think they're going to take Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov. And I do think that the mechanism of absorbing these will be through referendum that are carefully controlled by the Russian Federation. I do believe that there will be a new government put in play. You saw, if the rumors are correct, this former advisor to Viktor Yanukovych, who lives in Spain, was in Kiev in May, I forget in May 14th through 19th or something of that nature, having meetings with senior Ukrainian officials, including some rumors say Zelensky. And these meetings were at the behest of the Russian government, saying this is what needs to happen in terms of the transition away from a Zelensky government to a government acceptable to Russia, not only to bring about the end of the conflict, but to rule Ukraine in a post-conflict environment. It won't be this government. It will be something different, because that's part and parcel of the process of denazification, is to eliminate these nationalists and to rewrite the Ukrainian constitution in a way that's favorable to Russia, that meets the Russian demands. This guy was killed because of it. But the Russians, I've spoken to former prime ministers of Ukraine that are now in Russia. I've spoken to other officials. They are looking to a post-conflict reality where Russia is in control in Kiev. And that's a necessity. Now, is that sufficient? If Ukraine wants to fight to the death, Russia's already said, in addition to the 4 oblasts that I believe will now be occupied by Russia and subjected to eventual referenda for joining Russia. Kharkov is one of those, but now we have Sumy and Chernihiv that are going to be buffer zones. I don't know if there'll be buffer zones in their totality or 150 kilometers from the border, but we're talking about significant swaths of territory. Will Russia seek to incorporate these territories as well, or just use them as a demilitarized zone, and eventually return them to Ukraine? One of the things that haunts Russia is post-conflict stability in Ukraine. because it's not Russia's interest to have this cancerous tumor existing on its borders. Ukraine is a large nation, still large if they lose the oblast. It's who's going to rebuild it? How's it going to function economically? By absorbing Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, you're taking away vital industries. You're taking away access to the Black Sea, literally strangling Ukraine to death. This is problematic for the Russians. It's another reason why the Russians may not, have been so keen on forcing the Odessa issue. But now Ukraine has given them no choice. And so we're coming to what I've spoken in the past, what I call the Odessa moment, which is that period in time in the conflict where Russia will make a pause and give the Ukrainians a chance to end the conflict based on present reality. And if Ukraine refuses, then Russia makes the commitment to Odessa. And I think we are at the Odessa moment. But now the question is, what's next after that? And I call it the Lvov moment, where Russia will have to make a decision. They're not going to absorb Lvov or Western Ukraine, but if you get in a situation where you have a Russian-oriented government in Kiev that's not, and let's talk about a government in exile that forms up in Lvov, that government in exile cannot be allowed to exist. And as part of denazification, Russia will have to physically occupy Lvov and begin the process of the physical extermination of whatever they define as Nazi elements. I think Russia would prefer not to do that. It's a very risky move, but Russia's not walking away from this conflict, leaving situations unresolved. They've said that their goal is to get to the root causes of this conflict so that when this conflict ends, there will never be another conflict. And that can't happen as long as Lvov is in the hands of Western Ukrainian nationalists who seek confrontation with Russia.
Yeah, I heard talk of this as well from Russia, the idea that now that it becomes very evident that they will win the war, that there's also need to win the peace. That is, which represents a dilemma, because if some of this, more of these territories were under Russian control, I guess the benefit for the Russians, they would have this clear buffer. Also, they would prevent a lot of territories from being used by hostile powers in the future, using Ukraine as a proxy, that is. On the other hand, if they take too much and I guess destroys too much of the infrastructure, if Ukraine becomes a basket case, it's not going to be great for stability on Russian borders either. And it will also, I guess, makes relations with Europe even more unstable as well. But it was a very hard dilemma to solve. My last question was more on the how you see the, I guess you mentioned before, the moral question being put to Rubio as it looks like Trump understands the basics. The war is being lost, the Russians hold the card, but at the same time, as we all see in Europe, the moral question always comes in. That is, it's said that these territories of Ukraine, that it's not just that Russia gets them because it's Russian. It will disrupt international law. So some of it, based on the legal issue. But I think it was Rubio who said that, Russia they're not entitled to any of this. It's not theirs to put claims to. And, once countries start to talk about justice, they tend to often lock themselves into positions, irrespective of the realities on the ground. The problem, obviously, is always that justice is, very subjective. If you say it's not just for Russia to annex Donetsk city, you can say, well, it's not just for Kiev, but for the people in Donetsk who might not want to live in Ukraine anymore. It might be just. So again, just depends on, from whose perspective. But that being said, do you see this new war language being used a bit by Marco Rubio and others in the government may again lead to a more aggressive policy now towards, or at least less accommodating?
There is that risk. I mean, because look, there's an obvious retort, but I don't see anybody in the United States who's politically viable having the courage to say that. But I'd be more than happy to come to any European capital and stare their leaders in the eyes and hit them with the following challenges. Was it just to dismember Germany in a post-World War II environment, giving Silesia to Poland and dividing Poland up, giving Eastern Poland into the Soviet Union? Was this just, or was it necessary for regional stability and security? Was it just for the United States and Europe to support the Croatians to carry out a policy of ethnic cleansing to drive Serbians out of Croatia so that you had a more ethnically homogenous Croatia in a post-conflict reality? Just or reality? And when we speak about international law, no one's been able to contradict the Russians' articulation of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter in regard to the decision to go into initiate the special military operation. Collective self-defense is not just a principle that Russia invented on the spot, but a principle that was applied by NATO and the United States in justifying their intervention against Serbia and Kosovo. So the West literally has no grounds. Then I would confront Marco Rubio about his stance on the Golan Heights and why the United States allows Israel to annex the Golan Heights and feels that this is justified because it was the fruit of war, because continued possession of the Golan Heights by the Syrians represented an existential threat to Israel, and Israel had no choice but to do this. Then that same logic clearly applies to everything that Russia is doing. And the final thing is Russia didn't start this conflict. And I will confront every single member of Europe and every European government and the United States about the true history of their respective involvement in Ukraine. Uncomfortable history that they don't necessarily want us to get into. But I would like to know what their involvement was in the 2004-2005 color revolution in Kiev, because that didn't happen by itself. I'd like to know about the European money that went in to facilitate the rise of Yushchenko and the Ukrainian nationalists. I'd like to know about the role of the CIA, which had a relationship with Ukrainian nationalists dating back to 1948 and continued nonstop until 1990, when it was transferred over to various non-governmental organizations funded by USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. The German Marshall Fund. I'd like to get into every one of the funds that the Europeans, operate on. The bottom line is this war is a war that Europe and the United States were looking for. Europe doesn't talk about the role they played in the training of Ukrainian forces from 2015 onward. What was the purpose of that training, Europe? What did you train them to do? At least the U.S. Army is honest enough to put out a slide that says we train a battalion of Ukrainian forces every 55 days here in the West to go east to fight the Russians and liberate the Donbass. At least we were honest about that. Europe is incapable of being honest about what they were doing, but we know what their intention was, and we know what their intention is to this date. So for Europe to pretend or articulate in any way, shape, and form that this war was started by Russia, when Russia is the only party that has consistently sought an off-ramp from conflict, is absurd in the extreme and insulting. But as you said, the current political reality is such that nobody will survive politically, even if they speak truth to power. And right now, we don't have anybody in the United States capable of standing up to Marco Rubio during his congressional testimony. And there certainly isn't anybody who is politically viable at the moment who is willing to stand up to the European driven narrative that Russia is to blame for this conflict. Russia didn't start this war, but you know what? Russia's going to finish this war on their terms.
So yeah, just to finish, then you don't see a political settlement being possible. This will be ending with a Russian victory and a surrender on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, and I also see that the Russians are, again, the only thing more dangerous than trying to forecast Donald Trump.
Sorry, I keep asking you for forecast. I apologize. It's always not a great.
Is putting myself in the shoes of the Russian government, which I can't do. I mean, I can't speak for them, but I will say this: having studied Russia, the Soviet Union, and while I can't claim expertise, I always hesitate to use that term. I can complain. I can say competence in discussing matters pertaining to Russian foreign policy and national security policy. I think the Russians are looking at Europe right now as a region, Western Europe, as Europe in its totality, I guess, as a region in transition. And so normally when you make policy, you want known knowns, you want quantifiables. As Anatoly Antonov, the former ambassador of Russia to the United States, told me several times, predictability is one of the essential elements. It doesn't matter that the person is for you or against you. What matters most is predictability so that you can create policy that's consistent over time. So I think when the Russians, when they're looking for predictability, the predictability trajectory of Europe is one of decline and one of growing impotence. So for Russia, for instance, to say we're going to predicate where we want to be in 2 years based upon declaratory policy of Europe today, where they speak of spending 800 billion euro on rebuilding the army and doing this, that, and the other thing. I mean, even the Germans, putting the 45th, armored brigade in Vilnius in Lithuania. I mean, you had to read carefully to realize they said it's a virtual brigade because it doesn't exist. It may come into power, into being 2027 or 2029 or 2030. We don't know if it ever will. It's a virtual brigade. It doesn't really exist. But this is the thing. All of Europe's power potential is virtual. You had Mark Rutte acknowledge that Russia is producing 4 times the amount of artillery ammunition than all of NATO combined, and that includes the United States. That's because the Russian defense industry is, mobilized far more efficiently than Europe, and Europe can't catch up. They're incapable of catching up. This is all wishful thinking on their part. The concept of harnessing their industrial potential and matching it with, the support of the people, because that's an important element that's missing. In fact, it is the fatal element in the European vision, because as we speak, we see forces of transition. I mean, yes, the European centrists were able to, I believe, manipulate the election in Romania to ensure that their person stayed in power. But how much longer is that going to be the case in Poland? We now have a runoff election on June 1st for the presidency, in which a Trump-like figure, a conservative historian, may in fact win out against Donald Tusk's, handpicked person for prime minister. In Portugal, it was the Chigar party has surged now to have 58 seats in the parliament. And as we watch the Portuguese replicate the political failure of the rest of Europe, they can't keep a government in place. They had a socialist government elected in 2022. It fell, replaced by centrists in 2024, who collapsed under pressure from the socialists for this election today, where they've won, but they don't have a majority. But meanwhile, the right-wing party surges. In France, Marine Le Pen could play her party could be a very important factor in, changing French politics. Keir Starmer is not a solid foundation of political stability. The AfD, the crisis that may arise if Germany feels compelled to ban them. So from a Russian perspective, you can't build policy based upon statements being made by a European entity that lacks any sort of political stability. And if you are projecting trajectories, the trajectories show that it's the charge of the right brigades, if you want to say so, the political right moving to harness political dominance in Europe. And if that's the case, then it's a safe bet for Russia to say that as long as they are balanced in their approach, that by the time Russia's ready to dictate terms of surrender to Ukraine, Europe will be in a position to accept the inevitability of that outcome, that the people today that are promoting a trajectory of confrontation with Russia will no longer be in political power and no longer have the ability to promote these policies, and they'll be replaced by other people who are more accepting of a Russian reality. Again, Russia has to play this carefully. Russia can't overplay its cards. First of all, Russia's not in a position to. We're talking about the inevitability of Russian victory, but it's still going to require Russia to very carefully manage its economic resources and manage its domestic political environment. Right now, Vladimir Putin benefits from a political environment that has 50 to 60,000 Russians volunteering every month to join the military. But, politics is fickle. and you make the wrong decision, you get a chain reaction of events that create a negative environment inside Russia, and you could see that political support collapse. You could see the economy fall apart, and you have a different reality. So Russia has to manage this very, very carefully, and I see the Russians doing just that, which is why I don't think we're going to see dramatic, changes. I think we're going to see pressure. I do think the only point of drama will come, I think, with the military collapse of Ukraine. I do think that we're getting close to that point. But they've shown themselves to be surprisingly resilient, etc. The other thing that might be coming up is the political collapse of Zelensky. What will replace him, I don't know. But the Russians are betting on his political collapse and the creation of a vacuum that will enable them. Right now, they're insisting that there be, as part of the preconditions of peace, that there be elections in Ukraine. But again, I think the Russians are going to be very measured, but they're moving towards resolving the totality of the problem, which includes Lvov. And I think that they're going to time this with the degradation of centrist political control in Europe.
Well, you're certainly very correct about the resilience of the Ukrainians. I mean, even now there's a lot of cracks appearing. The Kupiansk looks like it's being caught in a pincer. You have this huge advancements going down in Zaporozhye region. Siversk might also come under, might fall, and after this you have the whole Slavyansk area as well. So after Konstantinivka as well. So there's a lot of things happening now, but. So it feels like it's the collapse is intensifying a bit, but it's also one shouldn't underestimate, I guess, the Ukrainians, because I thought that they would have begun to fall apart already, but they're holding in there though. So,
well, I think one of the when we talk to the Lvov moment, one of the reasons why I bring that up too is, and again, this is the big brush analysis. So, take it for what it is. But, the population of Ukraine in 2022 was 44.8 million, something of that nature. And today, what we see is 3.5 million people, Eastern Ukrainians, have taken Russian passports in the newly constituted republics or oblast districts of Russia: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Another 1.5 million Eastern Russians have fled to Russia. Between 6 and 8 million have fled to Europe and live in refugee status. And so the population of Ukraine is down to around 33 million. That from a political demographic standpoint, that means that when you looked at the totality of Ukraine in 2022, you could say that the political center of gravity was in Kiev. But now, with the dilution of the demographics, with the Eastern Ukrainians, the Russian speakers fleeing or taking Russian passports, the political center of gravity has shifted to Lvov. And these are hardliners. These are, in many cases, fanatics. And I think that contributes to the resilience, and that because Ukraine in many ways is redefining itself as a nation, a national entity. And so, whatever political dynamic existed in the past, it doesn't exist today. I think there's part of this resilience comes from the fact that we're dealing with genuine fanatics who will not accept surrender as an option, and many of whom are willing to die before they surrender.
And it was supposed to be my last question, but sorry. Do you think they will take Kyiv? I mean, it seems like a bridge too far, but again, beyond power interest, it seems to have a very significant role in the whole national identity as, the mother of all Russian cities and all. Do you see this?
What I see happening is I see the collapse of the Zelensky government, and I see a Ukrainian government taking control that will do the bidding of Russia. So you don't need to physically take Kiev. What I see happening is that politically it'll become aligned, and that you won't have Russian troops occupying Kiev, but you'll have Kiev becoming, I think you'll see a change in the security apparatus, a change in. I don't think any streets will be named Stepan Bandera Boulevard anymore. But I don't see Russia physically occupying Kiev. No, not. I don't see Russia taking Kiev like the Battle of Berlin. If Russia comes into Kiev, I see it to be sort of symbolic after a political change. But no, that I don't think there's going to be a Battle of Kiev.
Anyways, yeah, I had like 3-4 last questions, so I will leave it there. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Professor Said Mohammed Marandi from the University of Tehran is the doyen of commentators on all matters Iranian and indeed much further afield, increasingly. They're lucky to have him. We are even luckier to have him as a regular guest on our show. Professor, wonderful to see you again. You may have heard, perhaps not, I struck a slightly optimistic note in my analysis of where we are now on the American-Iranian talks. Are you optimistic?
I think I should be cautious, although your logic is, I think, very strong. But the problem, of course, is that the United States is not the political order in the United States is not the most logical or reasonable, and the Israeli regime is a genocidal regime. So it's really hard to say. It is a positive sign that the United States backed down, at least in private, in order to get the Iranians to come to the negotiating table again. We had the 5th round of talks, and the Iranians, although they went in late a bit, I think, to send a message to the Americans, but the fact that they did participate was because the United States sent a message through the Omani government, basically saying that their public stance is different from their private stance. But I think the most important issue is what you alluded to, and that is that Iran is a missile and drone superpower. And I think the Russians will attest to that. If there is a strike against Iran by the Israeli regime, Iran will launch a major strike, which will be far, far more effective than what was called True Promise 2. In fact, Iran owes the Israeli regime a True Promise 3, and this would, I think, give an excuse for the Iranians to go much further than what they were thinking of doing for True Promise 3. So it would be a foolish move by the Israeli regime. They will not be able to do it without the Americans. Last time when the regime attacked Iran, and it wasn't a very effective attack, but they used the United States supported them by using their bases in Turkey, in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Bahrain, their radar installations. They helped Israeli jets to refuel. Without the United States, it's impossible for the regime to carry out any sort of effective strike. Of course, this also shows how sadly countries in our region are complicit in what the United States, what the Israelis have done in the past. Whenever the Iranians struck the Israeli regime, these same radar installations in Turkey and in the Persian Gulf region were used to help Israel, the Israeli regime. And I assume that the same will happen in future.
And if it does, of course, Iran has made clear that anywhere from which this attack originates or is facilitated will be regarded as legitimate targets for Iranian countermeasures.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. The Persian Gulf region is full of American bases. And these are all glass castles and glass mansions that can be destroyed very easily. Yeah, I would imagine that if the Americans were to actually strike Iran at some point, they would have to do it from Diego Garcia. And that would be a 5,000-kilometer flight. And they would have to fly over Iran. And I would guess that these planes, some of them will be shot down. And of course, the Iranian counterstrike will be massive. Wherever there are American bases, they would be seen as legitimate targets, or American interests that are not in bases. But if attacks are carried out from Qatar, from the Emirates, or anywhere else in the region, those countries will be seen as hostile, the entire country. So I find it very unlikely that they will allow those bases to be used directly. But one important point is that if the Israeli regime attacks, I think that the Iranian counterstrike would be decisive. And the Iranians, over the past few months, have been preparing themselves for an American or an attack by the United States or by the Israeli regime. They've been improving their air defenses massively, and they've been preparing their missile and drone capabilities for greater precision and greater accuracy. I think it will be devastating for the Israeli regime if they carry out an attack. So I agree with your logic. I was listening to you before I came on. I think you're absolutely correct. The only thing that stands in the way of your logic is the fact that the Americans, the empire, the Israeli regime have nothing to do with logic usually.
Now, I made the point, I'm sure you're aware of it, even from Tehran, but here in the West, it's patently obvious from statements being made in Canada, in the United Kingdom, elsewhere on the mainland of Europe, by politicians and by publications and broadcasters that have clung ferociously, even Piers Morgan clung ferociously to being shills for Netanyahu's slaughter of the innocents, of the firstborn or even unborn. They have now done a 180 and are now, in some cases, Bono, for example, who hasn't said one cheep in the whole of this affair, are calling for Netanyahu to go, for Israel to be freed from Netanyahu's grip. And in Piers Morgan's case, he has, in his own words, turned on the Israeli government and acknowledged that in all those shouting matches he had with thee and me, he was wrong. Now, there's greater rejoicing, as you know, in heaven when a sinner doth repent than the 99% who hath no need of repentance. So on one level, we should congratulate each other on the role we've played in bringing about this change of heart. But what do you think really lies behind it? And what does it portend for Netanyahu?
I'm not sure how long this change of heart will last. We'll see about that. But I think the reason for all this change is not because any of these people have suddenly discovered religion or they've seen the light. It's because that the public has turned against the Israeli regime. People are waking up, despite the fact that they are shutting down Instagram accounts, as I think your next guest will explain, not just because they're shutting down Facebook accounts. I mean, they are shutting down Facebook accounts, Instagram accounts, and they are, in my case, I'm sure, on Twitter, they are massively trying to suppress voices that support the Palestinian people. But despite all that, people are much more awake than before. I am in Venezuela right now, and there's for the local elections, and there's a host of young people here from different parts of the world who are monitoring the elections. They're observing the elections. And when you speak to these young people, George, from all over the world, it's so encouraging. It's like when I speak with them, I have nothing to add. They are they know much more than me. They're so eloquent in the way in which they speak. The world has changed. There's such an awakening, and so many young, sophisticated speakers and thinkers are now active that the establishment has to make some sort of change. But even if Netanyahu is removed, nothing really changes in Palestine. They want to escape. They want to prepare the ground so that when Netanyahu is ultimately removed, they can say all is well now. It's like saying Nazi Germany without Adolf Hitler is fine, or that ISIS without Abu Baghdadi is normal, or Al Qaeda without Jolani is a normal and regular and legitimate organization. With or without Netanyahu, the Israeli regime is a genocidal regime. And the polls that you were referring to show that very clearly. It is not, the liberals in the Israeli regime are very different from the radical religious Zionists. But when it comes to seeing the Palestinian people as subhuman, when it comes to seeing them as Amalek, the majority of these people as well view the Palestinians just like their adversaries within the broader Zionist society in Palestine.
Now, Professor, I alluded earlier to the breadth of your analytical purview, which has spread now far beyond the Persian Gulf issues. So let me turn you, if I may, to what's happening in Ukraine. It's still a very high stakes business. President Putin might well have been assassinated today in a helicopter, as it happens. A drone attacked his helicopter. It was shot down. But imagine, God forbid, if it had not been shot down and the president of Russia was now no longer with us. The blizzard attack on all parts, actually, of Western Ukraine last evening followed in retaliation to a blizzard of drone attacks on Russian territory from Ukraine. It's still very, very dangerous. But it does look pretty much to me like Donald Trump has made a decision that this is not his war and that this war needs to be blamed on whomsoever it was that was operating the auto pen in the last couple of years of Joe Biden's presidency. Does it look that way to you?
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct, although you're much more of an expert than I. It was very clear from day one when the war started that NATO would lose. And despite all the propaganda, it was obvious that that Ukraine was going to be sacrificed and destroyed. And they pretended that the Russians were weak and the Russians were vulnerable, and they were taking apart washing machines to use the chips to make missiles. Well, we saw what happened last night, and how many drones and missiles are being used against Ukraine. And it's clear that the propaganda machine from day one was churning out nonsense. But in doing so, they've caused the slaughter of 1 million men in Ukraine for nothing. Nothing except for the fact that these wealthy elites in the United States directly or indirectly receive their wealth from the military-industrial complex. It's just like Afghanistan. Nothing has changed. You know better than I that Carter and Brzezinski, they cooked the plan to help these so-called mujahideen so that the Soviets would invade Afghanistan. People often think that the Soviet Union invaded and then the Americans got involved, but it's the exact opposite. The Americans started helping these extremists in order for the Soviet Union to invade so that they would have their Vietnam. In other words, they sacrificed the people of Afghanistan. And while doing that, they helped spread Wahhabism and Salafism and the terror that has destroyed so much of the region, whether in Syria, whether in Libya, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere. So the behavior of the US empire, the absence of morality among US elites and elites across NATO, it's the same as it was back then, and nothing is going to change in future. The only hope is that the empire will soon suffer such a defeat because it has overextended itself. It is at war with the war, whether trade wars or whether military wars or whether confrontations with Iran, for example, over the nuclear program. It has overextended itself. And I think with the horrible economic situation that we see in the United States and elsewhere may hopefully bring about a collapse of the empire and may force a change in mentality among American and Western elites. The only danger is that, as they say, drowning people grab at anything nearby. They may choose a most dangerous path, and that is to lash out as they drown. But I'm optimistic about the future, and I think that by overextending itself, the empire will ultimately bring about its own demise and a better world for the rest of us.
So the British intelligence services have let it be known to selected publications that the iron fist, the long arm of President Vladimir Putin did reach the back door of the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. MI5 probes Putin link to Starmer arson blitz. I have to laugh because I have to really watch that I actually spell arson properly in my many tweets on the subject. So we're asked to believe, well, first of all, as a matter of process, the mass media in Britain completely ignored this story. They played it down to a minor paragraph on the inside pages. And indeed, some of them told me that my hype over the matter was risking prejudicing a fair trial for the three accused. Well, look at that front page. As a matter of process, I don't see how this trial can now proceed. How can these three Ukrainian male models, massage artists, and aspiring actors possibly get a fair trial before a jury in Britain when the British intelligence services have just told the whole country that it was a Russian sabotage operation? Secondly, still on process, if it was a Russian state operation, then it was terrorism, not arson with a risk to life. It was terrorism, in which case, why haven't they been charged with terrorism? If they are alleged terrorists, then the matter should be dealt with at the appropriate level of the law. But maybe this is all just an afterthought. In the aftermath of not one single member of parliament on Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions having the guts to ask the obvious question, which I can tell you as someone who was in the British Parliament from the 1980s until last year, at any other time this question would have been asked. Some renegade MP, a Tory maybe, would have been told by the whips to just stand up and all innocent like, Uriah Heep like, ask the Prime Minister if he had ever met or had any contact with any or all of the 3 Ukrainian male model massage artists who were accused of arsoning around in his properties, 2 of them, and a motor car that he previously asked. Inexplicably, not one single member of parliament raised that question. If it had been raised, this matter could have been, if you'll forgive the pun, put to bed. The Prime Minister could have said, I have no intention of prejudicing this trial, but I confirm that I have never met and never had any contact with any of these 3 people accused of the arson attacks on my former properties. Well, in one case, still properties, lived in by his sister-in-law, but still his property. Now, the question I asked right at the beginning, how did 3 Ukrainian male models, massage artists and aspiring actors, £20 an hour, with the first hour for free, how did they know the former addresses and the registration number of the former motor vehicle of the British Prime Minister? This is a quite extraordinary thing. As I said on Wednesday in our record show, 2.5 million views so far. If this Sunday show keeps up, it will be the very first ever 5 million audience mother of all talk shows. But as I said on Wednesday, if the members of parliament won't rise to the occasion and ask the obvious question, to which he could have answered, no, I have never heard of them, never met them, then we would at least know, because Prime Minister wouldn't lie, would he? Then we'd at least know that we were dealing with a probable foreign-inspired, executed terrorist attack on the British Prime Minister, which would be an attack on the United Kingdom itself, and therefore very much more serious, deserving of the most serious charges. But nobody asked, and answer, therefore, he gave none. But looking at the allegation that is being made on the front pages of the British newspapers today, let's just say, if this is true, then John le Carré himself could not have written it. Russia, which we're told is a homophobic republic, recruited 3 male models, massage artists, and aspiring actors who are Ukrainian citizens. In one case, dual citizens of both Romania and Ukraine. And that those 3 male models allegedly attacked Starmer's property precisely to get this kind of story running and running. If it was Putin, it's a spectacularly successful act of espionage. It's a fantastically successful use of, for money or ideology, who knows, Ukrainian citizens to allegedly commit an attack which is going to dominate the summer in Britain, because this case goes to court in June. And when it goes to court, the accused will have to say something. And what are they going to say? That Vladimir Putin made me do it? The dog ate my homework? Vladimir Putin gave me however many rubles to do it? And though patriotic Ukrainian citizens, we decided to go along with it. Or are they going to say something else? Something deeply more personal. And if they do, then Keir Starmer's balls are on the slate. He will not survive the rest of this year as Prime Minister. That's my confident prediction. If it was the Russians, what done it? It was dazzlingly successful as a maneuver, and makes you wonder why a shrink-wrapped bottle of Novichok perfume has not yet been found in a charity bin nearby. My own views on this will be obvious. I think if you believe the Russians done this, then I've got a bridge in London I could sell you going cheap, cheap, cheap. I believe that it's much more likely to be another foreign actor if terrorist attack it was, and much more likely, even more still, to be connected to some personal business. But I'm unable to stand any of that up. I'm anxiously waiting the trial or the first appearance in court in June, as you are. But the fact that Putin is on the British mind to the incredible extent that the Prime Minister appears to go to bed at night dreaming of Vladimir Putin is a measure not of strength but of weakness, a measure of desperation. It's quite clear from the barrage that multiple Ukrainian cities faced last night, from a bewildering array of armaments, that air defense no longer exists in Ukraine, despite the scores of billions of pounds, dollars, and euros that have been spent on the aforementioned air defense. The Russians are able to strike Ukraine at will. The fact that they don't want to cause massive damage to civilian areas, still less to civilian people, is obvious. If it wasn't the case, then Kiev would have looked like Gaza right from the very beginning of this conflict. But I don't think the patience of the Russians can be guaranteed. And when I saw that an attempt to assassinate President Putin had been made this afternoon, I thought it's going to be a terrible night tonight in Ukraine. And there is nothing and nobody going to stop it. Not Keir Starmer, his mind's on other things. Not Emmanuel Macron, he's all mouth and no trousers. He and the German Prime Minister, the Chancellor of Germany, have no arms left. Don't believe me, they have said so. They have told the world and Ukraine that they can spare no more weapons for Ukraine without leaving their own armory dangerously denuded. So nobody's going to stop what Russia does next. And what Russia says it's going to do next is draconian indeed. The day will come, if it hasn't already, that they will beg for the terms that the Russians initialed in the Istanbul Agreement just a month or 2 months after the beginning of this phase of the conflict. Now, Russia's not going to just take all of the oblasts that it currently holds and who've held referenda and voted to return to Mother Russia, but is going to, on the back of the failed Kursk insurrection, the Kursk attack, the invasion and the temporary occupation of the Russian area of Kursk, they have decided that they intend to make a buffer zone right around the state of Ukraine, all of the east and south of it in any case. And so places like Odessa, places like Kharkov are going to be Russian occupied territory. They may not be absorbed into the Russian Federation, but they will be Russian occupied territory with the status of buffer zone so that they cannot ever again be used to infiltrate into the territory of Russia. So the outcome of this war is getting worse and worse and worse for what remains of Ukraine. And therefore, somebody somewhere has to tell Zelensky that it's time for him to go. And that somebody is quite likely very close to him right at this minute. That somebody is likely to be one of his own inner circle, one of his own military top brass, who are bound to be saying, the only way is down. The only way is more and more territory lost. The only way is more landlocking, so that we will have no access to the Black Sea at all. And that means that what's left of Ukraine will be little more than a Kosovo, UN Western occupied satrapy with no meaningful independent life of any kind, and used only as a knife in the side of an adversary. In the case of Kosovo, the adversary being Serbia, which is the rightful owner of that property, and in this case, a knife in the side of the Russian Federation, but not much of a knife at that. So, is the war coming to an end in the Ukraine? I believe so. I believe that it definitely will have ended by the end of this year. I believe that the course of the war has proved so disastrous that the European allies, as well as long ago now, the American ally, have decided to abandon ship. And abandoning ship means abandoning Zelensky. Donald Trump, in his famous 2-hour phone call with President Putin, is quite likely to have given a green light to all of this. It's hard to believe that the 2-hour phone call did not touch upon what Russia intends to do next. And we now know what it is they intend to do next. Now, are the Americans evacuating the battlefield in Ukraine only to engage in one elsewhere? Is a subject to which I now turn. I'm going to be bold and tell you that if Israel attacks the nuclear power plants of Iran, Iran will put an end to the existence of the state of Israel. They don't have nuclear weapons, but they have ballistic superpower that the air defenses of Israel simply cannot cope with. Already, 20% of the people of Israel have left the country. And these are the most portable of Israeli citizens, with skill sets and with capital and with know-how that are easily sellable elsewhere in the Western world on the employment market. The employment situation inside Israel is as bad as the economic situation, which is now a basket case. Tourism is zero. Hardly anyone wants to go for a holiday to a war zone. And they are now desperately hoping for a change of heart in Washington, hoping not for more missiles, but for more money, because they simply cannot afford to continue this level of conflict for this long when they haven't even managed to subjugate the tiny Gaza Strip. The idea of them flying thousands of kilometers to launch an attack, which would be hotly contested on the day, on the nuclear industry of Iran, a perfectly legal nuclear industry, one that was operating perfectly legally according to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which polices these matters, during the period of the former nuclear deal with the big powers. There was nothing wrong with what Iran was doing with its nuclear power plants. Therefore, the idea that they should now stop enriching uranium when they are perfectly legally entitled to enrich uranium, and the idea that they're going to sit back and do nothing if Israel attacks those perfectly legal nuclear power installations is for the birds. The truth is, Iran will obliterate Israel if it launches this attack. Which begs the obvious question. Is this all a bluff from Netanyahu? Or does he know that the United States would enter a full-scale war with Iran on Israel's behalf? I personally believe all the signs are that America would not do so. Not just because it would be extremely costly militarily to American forces in the region. 50,000 American soldiers are sitting there out in various fields of the Persian Gulf region, and they would all be within easy shooting distance, like shooting fish in a barrel, of the Iranian response. Not only because the Straits of Hormuz would instantly close, causing an economic crisis everywhere in the world, but in particular in the Western European part of the world. Not only because if the Straits of Hormuz were blocked and economic activity was reduced to zero, and the price of petrol, of gas at your filling station would make your eyes water just before you had to turn away because you couldn't afford to buy any, but because the closest allies of the United States would all be left a smoking ruin. That is, the allies that Donald Trump left just a week or so ago, literally dripping with gold and diamonds and pearls and elephants and dancing girls. Who knows what else? If all these countries' economies are completely destroyed in the fighting, as I predict they instantly would be, if the property market of Dubai vanishes overnight into a smoking hellhole, then I don't think that American influence in the Arab world, in the Gulf region, would survive any longer than the smoking ruins. So I don't believe myself that Donald Trump will enter a war for Israel against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Therefore, I don't believe that Israel will do so either, which means it's all a bluff to assist America in the nuclear talks. Now, we'll hear from the Oracle, Professor Said Mohammed Marandi, in just a few minutes on where those negotiations stand. It seems to me more likely that a deal will be reached, and that deal will at least calm the danger of World War III in the Persian Gulf. And if the danger of World War III is calming in the Ukraine, as I believe that it is, then that's two big reasons to be cheerful. Lastly, the situation in Gaza continues to become a Holocaust on your telephone. Imagine if you had been able to watch on your telephone, more or less live, the pictures from Auschwitz, from Treblinka, from Birkenau, from the death camps, the extermination camps, erected by the Nazis and their allies in Poland and in Western Ukraine and elsewhere. Imagine if you had been able to watch the children going in to the gas chambers. Well, you are able to watch its modern equivalent, and hundreds of millions are doing so daily. I can tell from my own social media that hundreds of millions are watching daily scenes that would not have been worsened in the death camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and the others in the Holocaust in the Second World War. This is Babi Yar on television. We can see the people in the pits being mass murdered, children maimed, mutilated, beheaded, women, pregnant women. I just watched a fetus that was found outside its mother on the ground next to her dead body. This is a horror show beyond any comparison with anything that we have been able to watch before. This is Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes on steroids, slaughtering at will the most vulnerable, the most innocent people. And it's supported by the great majority of Israeli citizens. Well over 80% of Israeli citizens support the total extermination or permanent ethnic cleansing from their own land on the Gaza Strip. And I haven't seen a poll, but I'd be surprised if there were not similar numbers for doing the same next in the West Bank. And this is leading to a great many consequences, implications. It's reverberating throughout society, everywhere. More and more desperate efforts are having to be made by the Hasbara and by the clique of pro-Israel supporters that have so much influence in the political class and in the media class in Western countries. People are being struck down off Twitter. They're being cancelled from stage, or they're being charged with terror offenses for holding up a flag on a stage. Talk about crushing a butterfly on a wheel. We'll be discussing all of this over the course of the next 1 hour and
in terms of military capability. This United States, man, it's a big talker, but and it can it cause lots of death and destruction, but it can't force the submission of these other countries. And Iran is, in a whole different category, superior category than the Houthis in terms of military capability. NATO does not have the industrial base to compete with Russia. And Russia has a unique advantage, something that China doesn't have. There's only really one other country in the world that would compare to Russia in terms of natural resources. More and more countries are coming to recognize they'd much rather hang out with Russia. Russia's a much better dinner companion because they're not always telling you that you're a slob, telling you how to eat, telling you how to sit, telling you how to dress.
Let's end with a discussion on what has happened with South African President Ramaphosa in the White House. Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to watch the show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Larry Johnson. Larry is an American blogger, political commentator, and former analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. Larry, welcome back to India and Global Left.
So I didn't ruin my welcome the first time, huh? Okay, glad to be back.
There's just so much to discuss, but I thought West Asia, Israel, Palestine was what just happened with South African President Ramaphosa. But if I could start with the direct call between President Putin and President Trump, given the press coverage on it has been so polarizing as it has been. The mainstream Western press has, but not just mainstream Western press, even Al Jazeera has presented it as a kind of President Trump's surrender to President Putin, while the independent press, full of people who are less hostile to Moscow and a lot of them are friendlier, have labeled it as historic. If you could tell us, what do we know about these talks? What were the terms of the talks, and what is the implication of it in the upcoming direct talks between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think it's real simple. Vladimir Putin did not budge an inch. The position that he laid out to the Russian Foreign Ministry a year ago on June 14th, 2024, about what Russia would require as conditions to enter negotiations. These were not conditions for a ceasefire. These were conditions, the most important of which is, one, that Ukrainian troops must withdraw immediately from Russian territory. Russian territory now includes Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Those four oblasts, formerly part of Ukraine, became part of Russia in the fall of 2022, following a referendum. The West calls it a sham. They can call it a sham, a fake, whatever they want to call it. But from the Russian standpoint, those provinces are now part of the Russian Federation. They are Russian territory. Russia's not giving them back. And Ukraine doesn't have the military power to force them back. Second condition for Russia is that the West must recognize that as Russian territory, that Russia has sovereignty over, including Crimea. And then that NATO is off the table completely for Ukraine, that the rights of Russian speakers will be respected, and that the sanctions will be lifted. Those, that was President Putin's position a year ago. That was his position in the call with Donald Trump. He made that clear to him, but at the same time said, "Look, we'll talk to the Ukrainians. These are our conditions, but we'll talk to them and see if we can find some way to, that they will come around to accept these as terms." If Ukraine does not accept those terms, then Russia is going to take those terms off the table and impose more onerous terms, which will include taking additional provinces, most likely Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Odessa, maybe Sumy, maybe Kharkiv. Russia's going to control the direction of events. Trump, for his part, was the expectation among other Western nations, NATO, was that he would threaten Putin. Either you agree to an unconditional ceasefire or else there'll be bone-crushing sanctions. Well, he came away from that call basically agreeing with Putin's plan that, we'll talk to the Ukrainians. And Trump at this point is, I think, sort of, at least for now, divorcing himself from this, still not acknowledging the fact that if it were not for the United States, this war would have ended. The United States continues to pump in intelligence and material, military material and money, and keeps Ukraine afloat. So, this was, I don't view this as a ground-breaking conversation. It was, Putin again clarifying what Putin said all along. His hasn't changed since he and Trump started talking. Maybe Trump is starting to understand.
Are the so-called U.S. aid, which is basically military aid, are they still flowing into Ukraine? And are the CIA operations, which massively expanded in around 2017, 2018 during Trump's first term, are they still operative in Ukraine?
Yeah, there's still a CIA presence. There's still a U.S. military presence in terms of advisors, along with other NATO advisors scattered out throughout Ukraine. And so far, to my knowledge, Trump has not pulled the plug on him. Needs to. As soon as he does, they've now put in place the basis for getting this war settled and settled quickly. But Russia understands. You hear Putin continually talk about root causes. The root cause of this conflict is that the West took a decision 30 years ago, in 1995, to start conducting military exercises with Ukraine, to foster military cooperation with Ukraine, to arm Ukraine, to expand Ukraine's military, all with an eye towards using Ukraine as a tool, a battering ram to attack Russia. And Russia, until really about 3 years ago, was not economically or militarily prepared to confront that threat. But Putin's decision to launch the special military operation was based on the realization that finally Russia was in a position to confront the West. Because that's really what this is. This is a war between Russia and NATO. But it's a proxy war where the Ukraine is being used as the pawn. It's typical. Unfortunately, it's typical of my government and much of the West. We always like to use people from other countries to die for our projects.
How much do you think the financial sanctions matter to Russia at this point in time? Because the financial press is reporting on sanctions being part of the phone call, and they make it appear that that's a big thing for Russia. $300 to $500 billion frozen in its assets in the European banks, and over and above that, some sanctions in the payment systems and so on. Does that matter a lot to Russia at this point in time?
No. I mean, Russia would prefer not to have the sanctions, but Russia has demonstrated that in spite of those sanctions, its economy has grown. Last year, the economy was growing 4.6%. The United States economy is only like half that, a little over 2%. So, and we didn't have sanctions on the United States. So this is, it's another Western fantasy. We think we can control and dictate to Russia, treat them like an animal that must be brought to heel and forced to obey. And, Russia embarked as part of that special military operation. It also stepped up its efforts to work with China, India, South Africa, and Brazil through BRICS, creating an alternative financial system, a financial system that's independent of Western coercion.
What do you think are the Europeans doing? They also tried very hard to lobby through another phone call collectively with President Trump, and they are trying their best to sabotage this talks forward. What do you make of that?
Well, they're wasting their energy, and they're spewing a lot of hot air. Europe's in no position to confront Russia at all. And Europe can impose sanctions, and more often than not, those sanctions are going to hurt Europe, not Russia. So, if Europe wants to pay more for natural gas, go ahead. They want to pay more for oil, sure. There's not a single thing that Europe produces that Russia needs. Not a thing. And while Russia would enjoy trading with Europe, it is shifting away from sort of an obsession, I think, that has dominated Russia for the last 2 centuries, which was, they wanted to be part of the Western club, and they were always sort of like, I guess, consider themselves the ugly duckling. I don't know if you're familiar with that story of this ugly duckling that then actually becomes a beautiful swan. Well, that's what Russia's in the process of becoming, that swan. And it turns out that the West are the ugly ducklings.
Last time you were on our show, we discussed the US-Iran talks, and one of the things you said is that the talks would go on. There would be some impression that some openings would be there, but eventually the delegates would return to the United States, and the Iran hawks would sabotage it. And it's pretty clear that you were right, and we would come to that. But if I could ask,
hey, I prefer to be right as opposed to wrong.
Yes, we'll get to that. But if I could pose the same question in the context of Ukraine, Russia, what's your intuitive sense about where this would head to? Would it continue in the direction of what it has been in the past few years, or would there be a real breakthrough?
No, Russia's offensive against Ukraine has been accelerating, not decelerating. The dry season is upon us. The rainy season is over. Russia has been, over the last month, has been gaining territory at an average of 30 square kilometers per day. And that pace, I think, is going to increase. There's a couple of false assumptions on the part of many Western analysts. One, they assert that this is, quote, a stalemate. Well, we have the data of the exchange of corpses of soldiers, where Russia collects dead Ukrainians and the Ukrainians collect dead Russians. And then they exchange those bodies so that they can be buried in their respective countries. Over the last 3 months, for every dead Russian that's been turned over to Russia, Russia has turned over 26 to 27 dead Ukrainians. It's a phenomenal number. Now, there's a couple ways you can interpret this. One possible interpretation is that Russia is actually killing a disproportionate number of Ukrainians. I think that is, in fact, the case. But let's say that that's not the case, that the reason Russia has so many bodies is that Russia is advancing and Ukraine is not able to recover corpses because they're retreating. Does that sound like a stalemate to you? I mean, there's only, those are the facts. Now interpret the facts. So the fact of the matter is the West falsely asserts, oh, this is a stalemate. There's no military victory in sight. Oh, that's nonsense. The military victory is definitely in sight for Russia. And Russia, if they have to fight another 4 years to get it, they'll get it. They're not going to stop this because it's existential. Not that Ukraine is the existential threat, but NATO's role in enabling Ukraine to fight is an existential threat. So the whole notion of stalemate is false. And that Russia is weakened militarily. It's not going to be able to sustain this effort. Except today we heard Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, admit that Russia is producing 4 times the amount of munitions compared to all of NATO, not just one NATO country, to all of NATO. NATO does not have the industrial base to compete with Russia. And Russia has a unique advantage, something that China doesn't have. There's only really one other country in the world that would compare to Russia in terms of natural resources, being able to be self-sufficient. That's the United States. And yet the United States, through having offshored so much of its industrial capability, is in fact dependent on many exports, particularly from China, and specifically rare earth minerals that are processed in China that the United States does not have the factories in place to do it. Now, the United States could do that, but it would take 3 to 4 years. I've heard some estimates as long as 5 years. So, the United States is at an industrial disadvantage here. Russia is not just fighting a military war against NATO. It's fighting an economic war. And in that regard, it has aligned itself with China, India, Brazil, South Africa, as well as the other countries in the global south, Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, these other Venezuela, Bolivia. More and more countries are coming to recognize they'd much rather hang out with Russia. Russia's a much better dinner companion because they're not always telling you that you're a slob, telling you how to eat, telling you how to sit, telling you how to dress. They don't approach it with arrogance that they know best and that you're just a bunch of stupid foreigners, which is the approach of how the United States treats other countries.
My own observation on the stalemate thing was that the mainstream press was extremely adamant about the stalemate narrative, at least until the beginning of this year. And I began to see a change in a lot of them, maybe like far right newspaper still talks about stalemate. I don't follow them, but the mainstream, the FT, the Bloomberg, the New York Times, now there is a spin, particularly after President Trump humiliated Zelensky. Now there is a spin. They're saying that, oh, there was a stalemate at some point in time. Now there is no stalemate. So effectively, we were right at that point in time, but now the offensive has increased. I mean, now that's the narrative I see now. Even they don't seem to say it's a stalemate. But if we could come to US-Iran talks, Oman, who is mediating these negotiations, have confirmed that the 5th round would go ahead in Rome, but the prospects look very grim now. Steve Witkoff, who was considered a moderate, and a lot of people were hopeful, perhaps naively, has said that not even 1% of enrichment of uranium would be allowed by the United States, to which the supreme leader in Iran has reacted very sharply, saying that that's not up to the United States to decide. The United States says that Iran has to import all the uranium for even its civil nuclear project. They cannot enrich anything. What is your sense of what is going on within these talks? One of the things Abbas Araghchi, for instance, Iranian foreign minister, says is that we don't know what the United States negotiating team wants. They seem to be shifting goalposts every time. do you think the team that is negotiating on behalf of the United States is even aware of what they are talking about in those meetings?
Well, it depends on what they want. And, at the start of this week, the talks were not going to happen. They were supposed to have a fifth round. Iran said, no, we're not going to show up. But I guess Oman intervened. And I suspect Russia as well encouraged Iran, you go through it, make it be let the United States be the one who walks away and refuses to accept the deal. And Foreign Minister Arachi did send out a very brief piece on social media today, saying, "Look, if the United States wants an Iran that is not building a nuclear weapon and will not have a nuclear weapon, then we have a deal. The United States insists that we cannot have any enrichment of uranium at all, even for peaceful purposes. There's no deal. It's real simple." There was a point at which Witkoff accepted the 3.6% enrichment, which is in line for peaceful purposes. But when he got back to Washington, the Zionist horde descended upon him, and they've now reversed that position. We'll see if that holds. It's up to Donald Trump. And Trump can beat his chest and threaten, oh boy, you don't do this and there's going to be hell to pay. Yeah, how'd that work out with the Houthis? Okay. I'm sure people in your country understand. They look and recognize, this United States, man, it's a big talker, but and it can it cause lots of death and destruction, but it can't force the submission of these other countries. And Iran is, in a whole different category, superior category than the Houthis in terms of military capability. And that if Iran will hold firm in its position that we promise not to build a nuclear weapon. We agree that it will be inspected, but we're going to continue to have, safe civilian use nuclear energy and nuclear enrichment. Now, we're a sovereign country. If the United States refuses to accept that deal, then the only option left for the United States is going to be military action. And if the United States does that, I think it will end worse for the United States than it did with the Houthis. I think you will see U.S. military bases decimated. Plus, Israel itself will be hurt in a way that it's never been hurt in its entire 75 years of existence. And there will be some sort of, if you will, karma in that, given their horrific acts of genocide with respect to the Palestinian people.
Do you think that the military options are still alive within the Trump administration? Because I thought when the U.S. retreated, being humiliated from Yemen, and parallel developments suggested that they realized that the military options are over in Iran, because if it was over in Yemen, it's definitely over in Iran. And the Persian Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, they seem to be very clear that we don't want this destabilization in Iran. But as you are suggesting that the Zionist lobby must have sabotage, but if that's the case, then the possibility of bombing campaign remains alive,
yes.
Given Israel is frequently now renewing their bombing campaign in Lebanon. I mean, elections are due. Hezbollah would most likely sweep these elections in South Lebanon, but recent campaign in Toll, which is not of the litany, suggests that Israel is just normalizing this periodic bombing in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, it seems to be the case that the Lebanese government is incapable to defend its territory. It's also incapable to come at a diplomatic talk, while Hezbollah seems to have been weakened to a great extent. What's your sense about the U.S. participating in an all-out bombing in Iran?
I think it hinges on what happens tomorrow in Rome. If the United States insists that Iran must surrender all of its nuclear program, and then adds on, and you got to get rid of your ballistic missiles, and you got to stop contacts with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, Iran will walk away. No, we're not going to do that. Then the ball's in the U.S. court. I'm sure there are some, I hope there are some sane people at the Pentagon and at the Central Intelligence Agency who can sit back and accurately weigh the consequences of an attack on Iran. Because Iran is not in the same weak position that it was 10 years ago when the JCPOA was first signed. Today, it has a solid security agreement in place with Russia, and that if attacked in this way, Russia will be obligated to help Iran defend itself. And that can take a variety of tacks. It won't necessarily be an immediate retaliation by Russia, but Russia is definitely there to assist Iran with intelligence, with air defense, with trained personnel to supplement Iranian capabilities. And that if any Russian military personnel are killed or wounded in attacks by the United States under Israel, there will be consequences. In addition, Iran's relationship with China is much more secure now than it was 10 years ago. So, Iran is acting with patience and maturity. The United States is not. And, what I fear is that in frustration over the inability to make Iran do what we want to do, we will lash out, and that'll be a dark, dark cloud. But the silver lining in that cloud is that the losses the United States will suffer will force the United States to have to start doing some real soul searching, because we've been living in this bubble, this mythology that we've got the world, nobody could stand up to us. By God, we'll just roll over you. But we saw with the Houthis that wasn't the case. We saw with the Taliban that wasn't the case. We saw in Iraq that wasn't the case, was not the case. So the United States keeps deluding itself about its military prowess. And yes, we have the most expensive military. We have a lot of very costly equipment that doesn't always work reliably. And if the United States tries to strike Iran, and Iran inflicts severe damage on U.S. forces, air forces in particular, and possible naval forces, other countries in the region are going to step back and go, wait a second. Maybe we don't want to be aligned anymore with the United States. And frankly, if such an attack comes, the Saudis, Qataris, Emiratis would be in real trouble, because Iran will close the Persian Gulf. It certainly has the military capability to do that.
Do you think the Saudis, the Emiratis, and Qataris would be able to leverage and persuade President Trump against this campaign, given all the deals? I mean, it's clear that $1.2 trillion deal with Qataris and $1 trillion with the Saudis are like smokes more than reality. I mean, these are just numbers thrown out of hat. But it seems to me that President Trump or the United States administration now has two pieces to balance in West Asia. One is the traditional Zionist lobby in Israel, but
Right.
the other is its dependency now increasingly to partly subsidize and keep afloat its military industrial complex, because they buy all your jets and Boeings and so on and so forth. But partly also you need the sovereign wealth funds to be plugged back into the treasury market, which is doing extremely poorly given the recent downgrading by the Moody's. So you need the petrodollar reserve to be plugged back into the treasury and your stock market to be fueled up. And so it's extremely transparent that the Persian Gulf nations have a huge leverage now on the United States, which is even escalated by the United States even attempt to move away from China to the extent it can, would they be able to make some difference there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that if the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis together had a private meeting with Donald Trump and would say something along the following lines: look, President Trump, if you go forward with an attack on Iran, you will make it impossible for us to have normal relations. And all of the economic commitments we made to you, they're off the table. But if you go forward with this peace deal with Iran and you accept that they're not going to have any nukes, we will continue then with this economic accord, and we'll be on board to sign the Abraham Accord. We'll be willing to engage the possible recognition of Israel, but that recognition has got to come with, they've got to stop the genocide and the murder of the Palestinians. And you're the only one that can make that happen. That's going to put Trump in a very difficult position because he's beholden to this Zionist group of thugs. And he might decide that that's a price too high to pay. And if that's the road he takes, he will have effectively destroyed his presidency. Alternatively, if he ends up alienating the Zionist lobby and forcing Israel to capitulate, essentially, then he could be in a position where, he very well could get the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in bringing about a peace in the Middle East. This is the most dangerous, volatile area in the world right now. And it boils down to, how do these talks go tomorrow in Rome?
If we can come to the biggest mess, Israel itself, it's hard to even choose where to start from. There is just so much mess. But if you could tell us this new offensive, Gideon's Chariot, which is a ground offensive, much more escalated, being launched at a time when the ceasefire talks with Hamas are ongoing at Doha between Israel and Hamas. The idea is that it is to impose pressures on Hamas to concede more and more. But even the West, has reacted very sharply, particularly in Europe and Canada, to this disaster. And even people like Keir Starmer, Macron, who have not been in the league of, let's say, the more relatively bit more decent Spain, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and so on, who have been condemning this humanitarian disasters for a while. Even they came out and issued a joint statement that they would impose concrete steps if the offensive is not halted. What is your sense of how the West is reacting to what's going on in Palestine?
They're reacting way too slowly. They're in a position to really isolate Israel. And, I think, one thing that could be credible is that England and France could take the lead and say, look, Israel must be removed from the United Nations unless it stops this genocide. We cannot allow a murderous nation like this to continue to walk among other nations and with a mask of civility when it is engaged in such cruelty and barbarity.
Would the U.S. veto it?
Well, if it's done in the General Assembly, U.S. won't have a control over that. If it's done in the UN Security Council, U.S. would be likely to veto it, but then the U.S. would find itself quite isolated. And but the problem in Israel is there are tremendous divisions, but it appears that the most extreme Zionists, the people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, are insistent upon exterminating the Palestinians. There's been a video circulating this week. I know that Judge Napolitano has played it several times, of this one former, I think he was the head of the Knesset in Israel, and openly calling for the death, the extermination of children and babies. You said, "Oh, they grow up, they'll be raping our daughters." Oh, come on. That's the argument that the Nazis used about Jews when they had to kill the Jewish children because they would contaminate the race. I've lived long enough to watch that the Jews have become Nazis, at least in their conduct and in their language. And it's unfortunate because, there are still many, albeit a minority in Israel, that reject this and that recognize that the hope and promise that they thought Israel was is being destroyed by these extremists.
In fact, a week before the start of Gideon's chariot, Netanyahu, in one of these leak reports with the closed-door testimony made to the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, said that we are destroying more and more homes. They have nowhere to return to, said Netanyahu. The only inevitable outcome will be the desire of Gazans to emigrate out of the Gaza Strip. And all kinds of countries from Libya to whatnot, even as far as Indonesia are being discussed. It's appalling.
Well, and none of those countries are going to accept it. I think that it's a fool's gold. It's an idea that the United States thinks is practical because, again, they don't view the Palestinians as human beings. They don't view them as having any legitimate rights whatsoever. And unfortunately, many in my country are captives of this demonic biblical nonsense that this is the Jews' land and nobody else can live there, and God has said that everybody else must be exterminated. That's not the God of Jesus. Jesus was one about love. He was one about teaching that all people, not just some people, not just a select few who won what I call the lucky sperm club, that they happen to be born to a particular ethnic group, that they're the ones who are favored over all others. The message of Jesus was simple. All men, all women, all children are sons and daughters of God. All, not some. And so what Israel is engaged in is the destruction of God's creation. And that, within their theology, that may be okay, but that whatever demonic deity they worship is not one that is worthy of worship, because that deity imposes pain and suffering and death wherever that deity goes.
What do you think is the likelihood of Netanyahu to survive his political career in Israel, given the divisions you spoke about seems to be increasing? It's a lot of people are now protesting on the streets his new offensive, thinking in their self-interest that this would sabotage the prospect of bringing the hostages back. But his tussle with the judiciary has also spread now to new institutions. He has appointed the new Shin Bet head from an outside, David Jane. And he has also taken on pick up his fight with his attorney general. And there are multiple divisions within Israeli society. What do you think is his prospect of surviving, and is he using these wars to actually keep his political career alive?
Yeah, the war is his lifeline to political survival. The war goes away, Netanyahu goes away, and literally goes away maybe to prison. So he's using the war and the deaths of Israelis as well as Palestinians as his freedom ticket. And the divisions in Israel are growing and becoming sharper. They're not diminishing, and that's really represents a genuine danger to Israel.
What is the sense in the United States regarding the sentiment for Israel, given we see a lot of conservatives and right wing are also now coming out openly against Israel? But we are also seeing the Trump administration doubling down. For instance, now we are hearing crazy stories about Harvard not just freezing of its fund, but their CVs have been canceled, effectively saying that they won't be able to take up any international students, which is beyond imagination for an institutions like Harvard. I think 27% of their students are international students, and of course, it's a different league, stands apart from everyone else in the league of universities. That reflects that the Zionist lobby is still incredibly strong, because the whole fight with Harvard is not as much about DEI, but more about anti-Semitism. What's your sense of what's going on?
Well, they're equating any opposition to the Israeli genocide as anti-Semitism, and that's actually, this has nothing to do with the Judaism. This has all to do with the Zionism. And Zionism is a corruption. In fact, I'd argue a heresy of Judaism. But it is, we're living in the United States through a period just as dark as the McCarthy era. Back then, it was all communists. We had to root out all communists. Now they're trying to root out all Zionists. The problem is the media, which very few people watch, is beating heavily the drumbeat about this anti-Semitism on the rise, and we got to stop it. But the average people that are not watching that news, that are on TikTok, that are on X and other social media platforms, they're seeing the truth of what's happening, what the Zionists are doing to the Palestinians, and there's growing opposition to it. Now, there was an unfortunate tragic event last night in D.C. where this one, alleged supporter of the Palestinians, and I question. There's always in the back of my mind wondering if he was a dupe.
He's also reported to be Chicago-born.
Yeah, that he was somebody who did this as a way to try to further inflame the situation and garner more sympathy for Israel. There's no justification for his act. That young couple were not carrying arms. They were not engaged in any kind of atrocities. And again, I'm firm on this principle, regardless of ethnicity, religious background, cultural identity. There is no justification for killing civilians. The only time you can use or should use lethal force is when your own life is in imminent threat and danger, and you have no other alternative but to try to protect yourself. Well, that's not what's going on here, and unfortunately, this has created a wave of sympathy for Israel to justify continuing the genocide. But that said, there are still many and a growing number, particularly people that are under the age of 30, in opposition to the Zionists, the monsters that they are.
And some of the largest associations of American Muslims who've been at the forefront of the Palestinian solidarity movement in the United States have immediately come out and condemned the act unequivocally.
Yes, yeah, as they should. And, frankly, I hope the Hamas leadership comes out and condemns it, because you don't defeat the Israelis by becoming the Israelis. If you start killing women and children, that was the big lie that Israel created after October 7th. And that was, Hamas actually did not kill any babies, despite the lies, the pernicious lies that were spread. And it was Israel, actually Israeli soldiers did kill some of their own children through, reckless gunfire and targeting cars without any regard for identifying who was in those cars.
Let's end with a discussion on what has happened with South African President Ramaphosa in the White House, given you have written something on the issue. And it's very offensive, honestly, for those of us in the Global South to see how leaders of the Global South are being treated in the White House. I mean, just to give a little bit of context to our viewers, this land expropriation bill was made into a law in January, which replaced a 1975 old law, which was not very clear about the terms and conditions of government expropriation of land. But this bill that became a law basically allowed the government to seize land from any private owner, white or otherwise. It's not just white land, it's white or otherwise, for public purposes and public interests, including infrastructure projects, public service expansions, environmental conservation, land reform, or equitable resource distribution processes. Now, guess what? For those of us in India or in China, this looks pretty normal. And the fun fact is that these expropriation laws exist in the United States. The government can basically seize land from anyone in the interest of public interest. And the fair compensation clauses are there. Of course, in some cases, they say that they may not allow fair compensation, which is the case in most of the countries. And this has been made into this narrative of white genocide, while President Ramaphosa has himself acknowledged that there is an issue of violence on farmers, cases of robbery, extortions, and so on, which is both on black and white farmers because of the remoteness of these locations. And finally, I want to also place it in the context of South Africa, because a lot of people has no idea of the history in South Africa, how the Dutch colonialists went there and hijacked everything. Even today, after all that civil rights movements, 7.3% are white Africans who own 70% of the land. So quite naturally, if you come up with a land expropriation law, then the whites would be significantly and disproportionately on the negative side. And a huge majority of the black South Africans don't own any land. So that was my observation. I wanted to place it in context, given we are a channel from the Global South and in solidarity with them. But please tell us what your reflection on this was.
Well, it was a political hit job by Donald Trump. And what was so offensive about it is that he accused President Ramaphosa and South Africa of engaging in genocide. I mean, to make that accusation shows he doesn't even understand genocide. He showed a film clip of one Julius Malema, who is the leader of an economic freedom fighters party. And again, he was saying very outrageous, disturbing things about taking white-owned land and giving it to black people with, and so that plays right into this racist meme. I think President Ramaphosa missed a great opportunity, because I on my blog, sonar21.com last night, I wrote what I thought President Ramaphosa should have said and done in response to what Trump said. And let me read it. Mr. President, speaking to Trump, your accusation that my government is engaged in genocide is false and libelous. Unlike you, we allow free speech in South Africa, even comments as reprehensible as those made by Mr. Malema. I would remind you that there was a time in the United States that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1977 that neo-Nazis had a constitutional right to march, citing freedom of speech and assembly under the First Amendment, even if the speech was hateful and deeply offensive. As you may recall, this ruling concerned a march in Skokie, Illinois that was led by Frank Holland, the head of the National Socialist Party of America, a neo-Nazi group in the late 1970s. I'm sad to see that you no longer are a defender of the First Amendment of your Constitution. What I find more troubling is that you apparently value the lives of white South Africans over the lives of the Palestinian people. You have welcomed and embraced Bibi Netanyahu in this very office, a man who, by his own words, advocates the slaughter of Amaleks, a biblical word he now associates with the Palestinian people. More than 60,000 children, women, men, and elderly civilians have been murdered by Israeli forces at the direction of their government since October 7th, 2023. This is the policy of the Zionist government. Yet when you welcomed Bibi Netanyahu into your office, you said nothing. By your silence, you endorsed an actual genocide that is taking place now. Shame on you. The policy of my government is that no violence against civilians, regardless of the color of their skin, is acceptable. However, I will not sit silently in the face of your unfounded accusations that I tolerate or endorse genocide in South Africa. You, as head of the United States, have no moral authority to lecture us. Your government has killed millions of civilians in Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. Your own government is still supplying weapons to Ukraine that are being used to kill civilians in Russia. I will remind you of the words spoken by Jesus. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And with that, if I were President Ramaphosa, I would say, this meeting is over. We are leaving. Thank you for your time. And they should have walked out.
That would have gone viral all over the globe, but particularly in the Global South, who is just frustrated by how Global South leaders are treated or have been treated historically in the West. Just to finally wrap up with one final question, how much do you think this was because of the Zionist lobby, South Africa being punished for taking the case of genocide to the International Court?
Oh, totally.
Okay, because the other thing is also Elon Musk's own interest, given his legacy in South Africa with the apartheid, and given his aggressive push for the Starlink project, and he's proposing it as a PPP, public-private partnership, and South African law says that if the government is involved, then there are clauses to include the black majority, which is overwhelming majority. And this is something which should be understood by Americans. It's not the DEI in the big Wall Street and big universities. It's 92% of their population not owning almost anything. So it's not that DEI, which is very important to understand. Do you think that was also a context, or was it mostly the genocide thing?
No, I think, it was the genocide was simply, one motive. I think it was probably the predominant one, but it's also feeding into this. It really is. This is a racist meme to highlight some of the abuses of whites in South Africa. Look, I would have had little problem with Trump doing this if Trump had, when Bibi was done there, had done the same thing to Bibi. If he showed, hey, we're going to call out everybody who's showing any kind of discrimination, regardless of who they are. But that's not what he did. This was, we're going to show you, the Black South Africans, who's the boss. And it's that in and of itself is just, it's a racist meme. It's the equivalent. The United States, it'd be like, you're wanting to interview me, and I said, okay, yeah, you want to interview me? Okay, you need to take off all your clothes and sit there naked while you talk to me. And you'd go, you're out of your mind. I'm not doing that. And, you'd be right. So, but, a lot of times the United States tries to dictate how others should live, talk, act, without any regards to its own words, its own actions. And it's this level, I think, you put your finger on it. This hypocrisy is quite apparent to the majority of the world, particularly of the Global South. And I think they're getting fed up with it. They're getting tired of it. They just, while they've tended to like Americans and try to view America in a positive light, I think America's constant refrain of trying to control and dictate to others what they must do, while at the same time we ourselves are engaged in horrific acts of death and destruction visited upon people largely in the global south.
It was such a mixed emotion for me to see all that drama, because on one hand, what I felt was that President Ramaphosa indeed lived up to what a lot of people of color and anti-racist radical activists say, that we have to preserve our humanity, which is even if the person in front of you behaves like a lunatic, we
Yeah.
have to be always decent, because we cater to a universal morality which accommodates everyone. But on the other hand, there is this also sadistic, perhaps, frustration about how people of color have been treated for a very long time. But Larry, this was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much. We'll leave it there, and hope to see you again soon.
Hey, well, I thank you.
Kofi, follow me.